Good afternoon. Welcome to John Jay College. My name is Crystal Rodriguez. I'm the Policy Director over the Data Collaborative for Justice here at John Jay. We welcome all of you to our program today. No rush. I want to encourage you all to grab snacks and water that are over there on the left. We will be commencing the program in about 10 minutes or so. For the panel discussions, we are asking for audience members to write down any questions on note cards that you might have. So Olive, my colleague here, will be handing out a few. So if you need one, give her a wave and she'll come over and bring you a note card. Thank you.
Hello, we're going to get started now. Everybody, please take your seats. We're going to get started. Please, everyone, take your seats. Judge, take your seat. Okay. Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to see all of you. We want to thank you for being here today and for joining this critical discussion. We at the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, which I am privileged to chair, are thrilled to be co-hosting this symposium with John Jay College and the Data Collaborative for Justice. I am grateful to Zach Katz-Nelson and Dana Kaplan and all the staff who have pulled this event together, and to all the speakers, panelists, and moderators for participating. Special thanks go to Arnold Ventures and the Art for Justice Fund for generously underwriting this symposium. We all are very much looking forward to the discussion and the reception, which will take place immediately afterwards, right next door. I hope as many of you as possible will join. Rikers is emblematic of the challenges we face as a city. It can also be a shining example of how together, and with strong leadership at City Hall from Mayor Adams and his entire team, shepherding this multi-agency effort through, we can overcome any obstacles. For so many reasons, Rikers was out of sight and out of mind for all these years, with both staff and incarcerated people who are 90% Black and Latino. Perhaps it was no accident that for decades, Rikers suffered from disinvestment. We've ended up with a jail system where half the population has received mental health treatment, including 85% of women. Over 1,000 people at Rikers have a serious mental illness. And 85% of the people at Rikers are there pre-trial, waiting for their day in court. Over 1,300 people have been in jail waiting for a trial for over a year. These delays don't just leave incarcerated people in limbo. They also deny victims the answers and accountability they deserve. And the longer people stay at Rikers, the more likely it is that they get involved in violence and the use of force, and the more profound mental illness becomes. Violence is endemic at Rikers. Stabbings and slashings happen every day. Weapons are made from the buildings themselves, broken plexiglass and rusted metal. 17 incarcerated people have died so far this year. All this costs city taxpayers roughly $500,000 per incarcerated person per year. We can and must do better, because the violence and dysfunction at Rikers does not stay there. It reverberates throughout our city. Gang disputes inside lead directly to violence in our neighborhoods. People who are destabilized and traumatized return home to our communities. This is not fixable. Rikers is not redeemable. It must, for the sake of our city and the values we live by, be closed. Rikers is by any standard a stain on our city. That was the conclusion 5 years ago of our commission. It was the call from the grassroots, where many individuals who had personally experienced the horrors of Rikers Island came together and formed the Close Rikers campaign. It was why elected officials came together to make closing the jails on Rikers Island the policy of the city of New York. Thankfully, and as a result of this, New York City law now requires just that. After August 31, 2027, legally, no jails can operate on the island and no people can be locked up there. The vision and a 10-year plan to meet the deadline has been clearly laid out. The challenge we face is one of implementation, made unquestionably harder by COVID. But thanks to the efforts of so many people across the city, at the halfway point, which is where we are now, towards closure, we have already made really considerable and significant progress. Design and construction is underway to replace Rikers with 4 new state-of-the-art jails closer to courthouses. Those will be joined by hundreds of beds in secure hospital units. Of course, this is not just about buildings. This is about getting better at achieving safety and justice. It's about establishing a culture of care and rehabilitation for anyone who is incarcerated, and dignity for the staff. And it's about investing in people and communities to provide real opportunity in the first place. We are not talking about anything radical here. We're talking about building on proven, effective policies and programs our city has operated and relied on for years. For over 3 decades before COVID struck, New York City reduced both major crime and the jail population by over 70%. This is known as the New York miracle. How could that be done? It was no coincidence. When those 2 things are done right, and we prove New York knows how to do this right, they are mutually reinforcing. We must do all we can to return to the successful, safer path. I want to touch on 2 key challenges we face and offer some solutions. These are discussed in more detail in a report our commission is publishing today, which is available on our website, morejustnyc.org. First, the jail population is artificially inflated. Yes, crime is up. And yes, most people at Rikers are there because they are accused of committing a violent crime. We have no illusions about any of this. But it is equally true that a massive segment of the Rikers population does not need to be in jail at all to ensure public safety. In fact, keeping him there ultimately degrades public safety, undermines victims' rights, and makes corrections officers' jobs much harder in the meantime. We can and must safely and smartly lower the jail population. This is not about opening the gates. It is about things like ensuring people actually get a speedy trial and that people with serious mental illness get treatment, not Rikers. Nor does this have to be done overnight, though surely it is urgent. We have 5 years to safely and methodically bring the population down. But it would help correction officers tremendously today if they had fewer people to manage and could consolidate operations into fewer jails. Our commission, along with the Center for Court Innovation, has produced a blueprint for exactly this type of safe, smart lowering of the jail population. Second, the cost of everything is going up. Construction is no different. So jails we thought were going to cost $8 billion are surely going to cost more, likely at least 20% more. On its face, that is certainly worrying. But allow me to put this into financial and fiscal perspective. First, The jails will be paid for with bonds, money we borrow and pay back slowly over 30 years. With the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance, our commission costed this out. Repaying the bonds will cost about $660 million per year, clearly no small amount. However, we also project that by shifting off Rikers to a smaller, more efficient, more effective jail system, we will also save $2 billion per year in operating costs. $2 billion. So our net savings for getting off Rikers is over $1.3 billion per year. Finally, there's the issue of receivership. While not the topic of today's symposium, whoever operates the jails will face the same obstacles and the same mandate: improve conditions as rapidly as possible. The federal court will do its thing and will tell us soon whether receivership will be considered. But one thing is certain: lasting change will happen only if staff buy in, if they feel heard and supported, while at the same time being held accountable. All of this, turning jail operations around and achieving a legacy, and indeed it would be a legacy, like closing Rikers, will take leadership, commitment, and cooperation. Together, we will make it happen. Today, we will discuss how. We will hear panels on reducing the jail population while improving safety, on the design of borough facilities, and on how to transform the culture of corrections. Because we will not achieve the closure of Rikers and a more safe and just New York City with any of these strategies alone, nor can one elected official or organization do this alone. It takes all of us in this room and beyond. We are clear-eyed about the task ahead of us and about the urgency of the work we undertake. But it is more than possible, and we can make it real. We can and we will. So thank you so much. Now, helping us to kick things off is one of the senior administration officials who is already taking on the challenge of Rikers, Mayor Adams' Chief Counsel, Brendan McGuire. Following Brendan, we'll hear from Darren Mack, co-director of the Freedom Agenda and one of the original members of the campaign to close Rikers. And later in the program, we will hear from our controller, Brad Landa. But first, Brendan, thanks so much for coming. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge. It's always a tall order following Judge Lippman. It's wonderful to be here with all of you this afternoon. I want to just start briefly by saying what a special place John Jay is for me. And it's such an important institution for the city, as evidenced by today's symposium. Throughout its history, John Jay has led constructive dialogue on so many important and difficult issues, and especially in the area of criminal justice. And the school's influence is not only national, but I think international in scope. When I had the privilege of serving on the board here, without question, my favorite part of every board meeting were visits by and presentations by the John Jay students. It helped remind all of us why we were here. And I think it's fair to say, and I know everyone in this room would agree, that John Jay students embody all the qualities that we love the most about our city. They are fearless, creative, diverse, and demanding. And they certainly do not shrink from a challenge. And right now, the city is certainly facing its fair share of challenges as we emerge from the past few years and we work to understand our post-pandemic identity. The challenge that has been and remains the top priority of the Adams administration is public safety and criminal justice. For the mayor, and I know for all of you in this room, the two of those concepts, public safety and criminal justice, are inextricably linked, and they have to be. And we know that it is not an easy balance to achieve between the two, but it is an essential one. And it requires a lot of hard work to get there. It also requires, I think, all of us to commit to active listening. My wife will tell you that I have no business giving out any pointers on listening. And I don't intend to do that today, I promise. But the importance of active listening to me with respect to these very difficult issues that so many people here within the city care about has really become very clear to me in the 10 months since I've joined the administration in City Hall. And just a brief bit of a detour. It became in particular clear relief to me this past weekend, where this past Saturday and Sunday, the mayor, in an effort for those of us in City Hall to do our best impression of John Jay, we convened a criminal justice summit at Gracie Mansion, where we pulled in representatives from every one of the stakeholders in the criminal justice system. We had all the DAs, we had all the criminal defender organizations present. We had representatives from the governor's office and Albany legislative leadership, as well as the NYPD, Department of Corrections, and so many others. And the goal was simple. And I think the goal here, it is probably familiar to those of you here today, to bring together representatives of all of those who care about the criminal justice system, and to give ourselves the time and the space to identify areas of common ground and paths to solutions. And we all knew that there were certain areas, certain paths that were going to prove to be divisive, that were not going to allow us to spend real time on solutions. And so we put those to the side. And we pledged to do the hard work of listening to those who come at these issues from different vantage points, and who we know on some issues have views that are different than ours. And we pledged at the beginning not to prejudge folks based on where they worked, not to prejudge folks based on a quote of theirs we may have read in the past. And I have to say, it was, as someone who is properly New York cynical, I was really gratified. And there are some folks who were at that summit here today, and we were very gratified by how the 2 days went. And of course, it was only a start. But I think in large measure, it was a productive 2 days, because we were all able to realize relatively early on that we all shared a common goal. And we wanted the same thing, which is a fair, an efficient, and a just criminal justice system. And I'm sure the same will be said of today's symposium. I'll close with just a word about Rikers Island. Since the day we entered office 10 months ago, this administration has been laser focused on Rikers Island and the Department of Corrections. And not just those who have traditionally been focused in these areas, principally DOC, but the mayor personally, a team of us at City Hall, and representatives from all of the other agencies that are integral to DOC's and Rikers Island's performance. And we all understand, as you all do, that the impact of Rikers on the psyche of the city cannot be underestimated. And we understand that every day. And, you know, in preparation for today, I reread the Independent Commission's reports, which were so well done and were such a service to the city by Judge Littman and his fellow commission members. And what I was really struck by, having reread them now, having been in city government for now these past months, is that one of the reasons that I think the reports are so important to today's discussions and discussions beyond today is the emphasis they place on human dignity. And Judge Littman referenced that word dignity in his remarks. And it's dignity not only for the inmates, which of course has been denied and which of course has to be central, but it is also dignity for the correction officers, the family members of the inmates, their attorneys, and the medical and social services providers on the island. For too long, this city has told that community, who does such important work, that they don't matter to us. While inmates and their families have been forced to endure dehumanizing conditions, corrections officers have been treated as second-class citizens compared to the other uniformed service agencies in the city. And far from expressing gratitude to the doctors and social workers and other support professionals on the island who do just incredibly demanding and important work every day, we ignore them, or even better, we decide to criticize them for not doing enough when we give them so little. And so whatever the future holds beyond today, the dignity of this community must remain our North Star in these discussions. And I can assure you that it always will be for this administration. So thank you again for allowing me to join today. And I look forward to doing a lot of listening and a lot of learning this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan McGuire, for those words. Thank you, Judge Littman, for your wisdom and vision. So this is a historic occasion for me, for every survivor of Rikers Island, for every family member who has a loved one currently detained on Rikers Island, and most New Yorkers as well. I was incarcerated on Rikers as a 17-year-old, and experience I will never forget. And when I returned home to New York City 20 years later, I was outraged to learn that the same things that I experienced when I was incarcerated on Rikers Island was still plaguing Rikers. At that time, Rikers had just claimed the life of Khalif Browder. I decided then to get involved in the movement to close Rikers. At the time, people said it could not be done. I don't think those people understood how organized and courageous survivors of Rikers could be. So this movement to close Rikers started from the leadership and vision of people who survived Rikers, and quickly grew to include hundreds of allied groups across the city, including faith organizations, service providers, legal advocacy groups, and grassroots organizations. I believe that New Yorkers believe in justice, and that belief has moved us to insist that our elected leaders take action to erase the stain on our city. In a city that prioritizes justice and equity, there is no place for a 400-acre penal colony where 90% of the people caged are people of color, where more than 1,000 people with serious mental illnesses are unable to receive adequate treatment, and where everyone is exposed to conditions that damage their mental and physical health. That includes the people who work there. We are halfway to history, and the nation is watching. Depending on how you look at it, 5 years might seem like a long time or a short time. Right now, even 5 days on Rikers feels like eternity. While those of us gathered today are committed to closing Rikers, at this moment, Rikers is still open. And it is still destroying lives. We have immediate work to do now to address the crisis on Rikers in order to meet the minimum standards of care for currently incarcerated people and ease the fears of every family who have a loved one incarcerated on Rikers now. Rikers is also a symptom of our city's failure to adequately house people with wraparound services, and a symptom of our failure to address the mental health needs of people in our communities. The work to move people out of incarceration and into treatment could not be more urgent. But again and again, people heard me say, and Judge Littman said it, Rikers cannot be fixed, Rikers cannot be formed, it has to be closed. And we are in the middle of a historic opportunity, and if we want to do this right, we have to do this together. This is not just about buildings, as Judge Lippman said. It's also about the culture of violence on Rikers, and it's about addressing the roots of incarceration in the most vulnerable communities impacted by incarceration. And regarding the culture of violence, Freedom Agenda believes that DOC staff, while they may hold positions of power in the jails, are also harmed by that culture. And the shift to a system that minimizes incarceration, but also ensures dignity for incarcerated people, will be a positive transformation for everyone, for people on both sides of the bars, and communities we all come home to. And speaking of those communities, we know the parts of our city that have the highest rates of incarceration. And that reality has been the same for decades. That is why City Council also voted in 2019 to initial $265 million in new community investments, the points of agreement, and to establish the Commission on Community Reinvestment to continue the work of addressing the decades of divestment in Black and brown communities. That commission submitted its first budget recommendation in March of this year. We are eagerly awaiting the mayor's response to our recommendations and for Commissioner Gary Jenkins to reconvene the commission, because we all believe that we need to close the pipelines to incarceration. However, it's going to take political will, courage, and action now to actually implement this belief. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to someone who needs no introduction, our great moderator, who I am so appreciative of his volunteering his time, as he always does, in the interest of justice. So, Errol, come on up. And the panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Judge. And we'll invite the panelists to come up, since we are going to need to make up a little time and get us back on track. There's a lot to get to, both in this panel and the ones that come after. I want to thank everybody for being here. We thank the audience for joining us remotely. And I'm going to invite those who know how to do this to use the QR code so you can get the full biographies of our panelists. I'll just give a very brief name and title, and then we'll. Yes, Mr. Hogan's on this panel, and then we'll get right to it. Joining me on this for this discussion, Judge Matthew Demick is here, the administrative judge for criminal matters, I believe, in the 2nd Judicial District in Brooklyn. Wesley Kane, the Chief of Staff for the Bronx Defenders. A.U. Hogan, whose title is Chief of the Streets from Life Camp. Richard Aborn, the President of the Citizens Crime Commission. And Courtney Bryan, the Executive Director of the Center for Court Innovation. All of these folks have a lot to contribute to a discussion about where we are at the halfway point toward closing Rikers and some of the snags that we've hit along the way. We're going to talk for a little bit. I have some questions for them. I'm going to remind everybody you should write your question on note cards. There are note cards somewhere around here, as well as a student to gather them. That's how we're going to handle the Q&A portion of this, which will come a little bit later in the discussion. I'll remind you again, but make sure you've got something to write with so you can join the conversation. Judge Demick, let me start with you. Long time ago, I sat in your courtroom when you were doing what was then an experimental project with the so-called mental health court. It was one example among many of the system trying to sort of divert some of its resources and thinking and strategy away from traditional law and order solutions. Thinking outside the cell, I think, is how a lot of people put it. You've watched that evolution from that time to now. You've heard a lot about why they want to both close Rikers Island and reconfigure it, make it closer to the courts. From your point of view, where do we stand with that? And do you think it's a good idea?
Well, since I was on the commission, I I did. But I'll address that in two ways. Obviously during the pandemic, it hurt the courts. I mean, if I talk to you about pre-pandemic, Brooklyn had 49 defendants in jail for over 2 years. Earlier this year, we were up to 236. Now, most of those are murder cases, and there were no murder trials for 2 years. Now we're down to 183, and my goal, and we're concentrating on these cases. As a matter of fact, out of my chambers, we've been really focused on these old cases to get people their day in court and get closure for everybody. And we're kind of working on a similar project with the Center for Court Innovation. I think we'll see some fruits of that as well. But my goal is to be under 100 by the end of the year and back to under 50 by the middle of next year. We have the gun initiative that Judge DeFiore started, which we've reduced the number of gun possession cases in the last 6 months by 400. And that's a moving target. So, cases keep coming. Nothing has stopped. And we also have now an armed robbery initiative. So these are things we're kind of concentrating on to get through the older cases and get back to fewer cases over standards and goals. So that's one thing. As a matter of fact, we did a pilot project with the Center for Court Innovation back in 2018, 2019, where we took the newer cases, started apart, and really had some strict guidelines. I mean, the DA's office promised grand jury minutes within 2 weeks. Every court appearance was meaningful. We had off-calendar appearances as well so that the parties could come together. And the study that came out of that showed that we reduced the processing time significantly. Now, you talked about the mental health court. So that, believe it or not, that was 20 years ago. So I guess it's not a pilot anymore. But that court was planned as a nonviolent felony court for adults. Within a couple of weeks of opening, the first cases referred to the court were violent felonies. So the clinical director at the time and myself felt that if we want to do the good we hope to do, we're going to have to take violent felonies. So much so that 20 years later, more than 50% of the people that we have in the court at this point, our caseload in that court, that particular court part, is about 310, 315 at this point. And so it's kind of labor intensive. But I think we've shown over 20 years that even individuals that have pled guilty to a violent felony can be released safely into the community. And at this point, we have about an 80% graduation rate. And so I think from my perspective as an administrator, in terms of case processing and trying to make sure that goes smoothly, but also as a court and diversion part, I'll say that Brooklyn, we have a veterans court, we have a drug treatment court, we have the mental health court, we have an ATI part really for emerging adults. And so I think the DA would probably agree with this, is that diversion is kind of the default in Brooklyn, and jail is the last, I think the last thing that has to be done. But of course, there's a spot for that too. But that's basically where I'm coming from.
Wesley, if I can ask you to pick up on that. I mean, none of this works if there isn't speedy processing. We've heard from a number of sources that has become sort of a sticking point, that the population doesn't go down because people are staying longer. The numbers in some cases are really quite alarming. The numbers of people who are staying are in detention for over a year, over 2 years, and so forth. From your point of view, where do things stand, and what needs to change in order to make sure the process of closing stays on track?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, and I appreciate Judge Demick's framing of this. There are a lot of structural issues and process issues at play. I think one of the things that we don't think about, and some of this is due to the pandemic, the delays obviously going from under 50 to over 200 was necessary based on, the pandemic shutdown. But there are some other structural issues that we're maybe not talking about. And that is like the attrition rate in both the defender community and the DA's community, right? People are just making different assessment of their lives and deciding to do things differently, contribute differently. So that loss of oftentimes senior experience, felony-ready attorneys on both sides is hugely problematic to the process, because then you have fewer experienced felony-trained attorneys who are prepared to go to trial if that becomes the option, or to even sit on felony cases. So for me, and especially in the Bronx, that's a huge concern, that how we think about funding for the public defense community doesn't really drill down in a way that was described. Like specifically, we think about raw numbers. You know, we're a staff of over 400, and you would say, well, you have a staff of over 400, most are attorneys. Why can't you like be standing up on cases and be ready to go? But it's not so easy. Felony cases and murder cases specifically requires an obligation to have a particular ethical experience. So I think that's something that I'd like to point out. I'd also like to say, though, that a lot of this over-reliance on the carceral system to address, you know, mental health courts, veterans courts, drug courts, like it still implicates a carceral system to address issues in community that's really never going to be successful in addressing any concerns we have about public safety. We need to get the community involved in identifying resources and needs that can be filled by community organizations and individuals who are frankly doing the work but are outside of this carceral system and are not supported sufficiently to allow for other avenues of addressing issues in the community.
If I can pick up on something you said about attorneys making different choices and not necessarily staying on both sides, I've heard from several of the district attorneys that discovery reform in particular has really taxed their resources, but more importantly for young lawyers, made it seem like so much of a paper chase that it's a burden, it's not rewarding. That's when they start looking for other alternatives. Has that been true for you as for the Bronx defenders as well?
Well, I will say this. I wholeheartedly support discovery reform and the turning over of evidence to the defense and, you know, people we serve who are facing charges by the state. And the idea that the state would have evidence, oftentimes exculpatory evidence, that is not shared with the defense, which then leads to people taking pleas, to me is just antithetical to any notion of justice. Mm-hmm. And, you know, most of us may not be aware, if we are not in this theater, trials don't happen anywhere but in Hollywood. It's just a fact. Like 3% of charges that move through our system results in an actual trial, jury of your peers, and a determination. Most of them are resolved through pleas. So the idea that you can have, you know, evidence that's withheld from the defense is just, to me, absurd. Mm-hmm. And I can personally tell you, as someone who has taken this journey through our carceral system, and having spent time incarcerated in New York State, as I sit here today, I have been in prison law libraries with individuals who have proclaimed their innocence for decades. And since my almost decade of being home, I can tell you at least 17 men who I know personally have been fully exonerated. And here's the key: the evidence existed before they took one step into a carceral space and was ignored, hidden, or frankly, people had, and by people I mean government actors, cops, and district attorneys, had agendas. And the argument could be made that the 80s and early 90s was so awash with violence, although I would argue that it was in very particular communities, and it was very particular communities who suffered the target of our carceral system. And I think that the system was so overwhelmed at that time that it made for lazy enacting of one's duties. And people were placed in cages without regard for their humanity, without regard for their innocence, actual innocence. And I think that's a travesty.
Courtney, let me bring you into this.
Can I add something
Yeah, please.
to this, which is that I agree and have heard this from others, that discovery reform, the implementation, no question on the, as you shared, the validity of it, but the lack of resources to staff our prosecutors and NYPD and Defense Bar to be able to actually make sense of the discovery is crippling, I think, our system. And so I would just make a plug for that. And then also the attrition is also around compensation and kind of recognizing that that's another reason that folks are leaving, and it's really critical.
Yeah. I did want you, Courtney, to offer a word about these experimental or, sort of what began as experiments, many of them by the Center for Court Innovation, that have now become sort of part of the system. Do those also need to be maybe turbocharged or expanded and made part of this question?
Yeah. And it's been an evolution over the last 20-something years, as you said, that sort of problem-solving courts and alternatives to incarceration were not the default. They were boutique, they were specialty, and now the promulgation over the last 20 years has been significant, so that's progress. Judge Demick mentioned the felony ATI court that exists in Brooklyn. We were also partners on a felony ATI court in Manhattan. And the idea was not to replace problem-solving courts that exist. It was to recognize a gap and more quickly and systematically connect people to alternatives to incarceration. 60% of the people that the Manhattan felony ATI court, 60% are charged with a violent felony offense. They're completing 12 to 18 months of intensive services and monitoring, and it's a range of services, whether it's employment, pro-social, kind of anti-violence programming, drug treatment, but it's very customized to that individual. And having a dedicated judge, as we know, the evidence is out there that problem-solving courts, part of why they work is having a dedicated judge, that judicial, the monitoring and engagement, how important that is. So the felony ATI court, I think, is a kind of an example of trying to expand beyond boutique courts, and in addition to just expanding the connection to a whole range of alternatives to incarceration, kind of trying to create a hub where we can connect people earlier. That's part of, I think, the delay as well, is looking how do we get to a case resolution more quickly, is can we explore alternatives to incarceration from the get-go as cases are moving through the system, and create, again, a system where we default to looking at an alternative before kind of getting to that idea weeks and months, sometimes years down the line.
Okay. Mr. Hogan, the entire question before us about the closing of Rikers is in the context of making neighborhoods safer. A lot of attention, including a visit by the President of the United States, has elevated some of the violence interruption and other community-based work as a key portion of all of this. When the president came, in fact, I wrote something about it because a little warning bell went off in my head, and it's the same question I think that we're gonna find over and over again, which is if we don't have the right resources or the right level of resources, it can become very, very hard to succeed. And for people to promote this as a strategy without giving the resources needed to enact that strategy, it seems to me that it's going to be a real challenge. But I wanted to hear, how are things going right now, and how does that fit into this conversation about closing Rikers?
I'm going to hold the closing Rikers thing for a moment, and I'm going to report to you straight from the street. The streets are not safer. You can look at any social media, people, any kind of media, for whatever reason, violence seems to be the trending thing. And we have to look at how back in the 80s when, brother, you were talking about these particular environments, 7 congressional districts, that was sending most of the young people to prison. And you got to look at how All these things are connected. You know, you can look at Queens Criminal Court, 10 years after the crack era, at least when it was extreme, because we still see crack in New York City and throughout the country, you started building wings. So it seemed to be very financially successful for some people and seemed to be very oppressive to others. So when we look at closing stuff, we're looking at young people that are incarcerated now, that are many of them are the children of the people that were either on crack, that seen those massive deaths at 2,000 and a couple of hundred in the city, during the 1980s and the early 90s, and the connection that we have to look at. And there needs to be a public outcry where you could have someone standing and waiting. I go into courts a lot of times for young peoples, and it seems like there's just a game. It's just a game about a life. The life that is committed to a family. Some of them are committed, have children, and all of them committed to a community. And we don't look at it like that. So we can't think about, now I'm going back to the closing, we can't think about closing the Rikers without fixing the people. The people are suffering, they're sick, they're traumatized, and no one's addressing that. When I look at the $1.3 billion per year and the $500,000 per person, how much money are we spending for young people to go to school? 2007, our then mayor closed up all night community recreation centers. They are treating us like we are games, and they pit us against one another to see who's going to come out on top. And unless something is really addressed about that on a different kind of level, where no one feels indifferent about different way we look at one another, the solution is we want to have public safety, and some folks want to close Rikers Island. I know that since the beginning of the time, when you can record where we were doing, when there were some people wrong, there was a place to send them. We have officers also that are suffering, but then you have also officers that are feeling comfortable and are afraid of the inmates, so there's still so much marijuana and other drugs that go into Rikers Island. And have we looked at what these people are dying from and what is the pressures? And so closing it, there should have been a conversation about closing it 500 years ago before we opened it. Thank you.
Okay. Richard A. Bourne. The current politicized environment, I'm sure, is as frustrating for you as it is for me. Meaning, a tragedy happens, that becomes the story. I can tell you in my newsroom and every other, that becomes the story for that day, the next day. Questions that fall off the table include things like, the health commissioner announcing that there are 250,000 seriously mentally ill people in New York and not nearly enough treatment beds. And that kind of comes and goes, and that's not the story. The story is the tragedy right in front of us. And especially as we head for Election Day in two weeks from now, we have a heavily politicized environment around all of these questions. How will that affect where we go from here?
As always, you have great questions. It's going to impact it hugely, and if I can borrow a phrase, just diverge for just 1 second. I just want to go back to something Judge Demick said for a second, because I think it's really important, and I just want to punch it up a little bit. When we first went to Judge Lippman about this gun court idea, the first thing he said to me was, go talk to Judge Demick, and it turned out to be the best thing we ever did, because the judge really understands not only the legal side of what he does, but the administrative side. And we set up this gun court process, and it went quite well. But to augment it, one of the things we did was that on a quarterly basis, we would meet at Mock J with all of the players in the system, all 5 DAs, the PD, OCA, DCJS, probation, parole, City Hall, and I'm probably leaving somebody out. And we would just ask very hard questions in a very small, crowded, hot room about what was holding cases back. Why weren't these cases moving? And lo and behold, in meeting after meeting after meeting, we would come up with examples of what was slowing down the system, and we would just knock them down, because you had all the players in the room. And I thought that was an amazingly effective process, and the data ultimately showed that the cases sped up, not only where we were piloting, because we were piloting at that stage, but citywide.
because everybody was at the table. So sometimes these intractable issues really aren't that intractable. You just got to get to a common space. And I just would urge that that process take place again. It was unbelievably effective. That's where the grand jury issue minutes first came up. On your question, you know, you cannot look at this issue unless you're willing to say it is a political issue, because it is a political issue. And it's not just a political issue to us. I dare say we all get it. We all understand, you just cannot deny that the biggest victims of the criminal justice system are young men of color. It was true in the 70s and 80s and 90s, in the 20s, and it's true now. It's always been, it's horrendous, it's not just. And one of the outcomes has been this institution we call Rikers Island, which I agree should have been closed before it was opened. It is just, there's just no way we can sustain the opening of that. But unless you're relatively close to the system, that's not intuitive, because what's intuitive is if you put people in jail, crime will go down. That's what the public thinks. Don't think of us, think about the public. So I think one place where we all need to do a better job is to better explain why keeping people out of the system actually increases our safety. That's counterintuitive, but it's factual. And I think we all need to do a better job of articulating that. We are all ambassadors on this issue. Every time you speak with somebody in any setting and this issue comes up, you have the opportunity to make 2 or 3 points. And I think one of the greatest points we need to make is what I said. Keeping people out of jail, out of prison, actually enhances public safety, because of the second point, which is that we don't have an alternative to jail or prison for very violent people, but there's no one that knows this system who is going to adequately argue that it's a good thing for that person. It is not a good thing for that person. Bad things are going to happen to that person while they're in the system, and they're going to come out in much worse shape than when they went in. We need to make those points as well, because that's also not intuitive. You can just see what the 2 candidates for governor are doing around this issue. I mean, you know, you cannot extract bail reform from this conversation. You have to have that conversation. The Republican candidate is just constantly banging away at bail reform, saying it's a huge mistake not to have changed the bail reform law. And guess what? He's now within, by some polls, 4 points of a Democratic incumbent in a state that I think is 4 or 5 to 1 Democratic. Since Pataki, there has not been a Republican elected governor, and I'm sorry, he may win. I mean, he is within striking distance now. So I think we all have to try and understand what drives the political discussion, and not here in the greater public, and be prepared to answer those questions. It also, Brendan, if I may say, it also gives elected officials who are really very much with us political cover. And if you're going to be in the advocacy space, and we are all in the advocacy space, you've got to give your elected officials the political cover to do the kinds of things that you want them to do. So yes, it's a fiercely political question. It's only going to get more political. The numbers around crime are interesting. Shootings and murders are coming down, but rape, robbery, assault, grand larceny are skyrocketing. I think that will level out and start reversing at some point, but not for a while. We need to explain why putting somebody in Rikers or in the state system is not a good thing. We can increase public safety by keeping them out. That would be my response.
Yeah. Judge Demick, if the numbers continue as they look now, with shootings, homicides coming down, other offenses going up, a lot of pressure coming on the system in general for more people to be remanded, what happens to the question of moving forward with the plan to close Rikers?
Well, I mean, my own feeling is that we see a lot of hopeful signs now coming out of the pandemic. I mean, when COVID first came in, we let, in Brooklyn alone, in the first couple of weeks, 300 writs were granted to get people off Rikers Island because of the conditions there, and obviously the dangerousness of people getting infected with COVID. But as I said, you know, it was difficult. I'll say 2 things. I mean, very quickly, the court system was able to get up and running with a virtual virtual appearances, we had no choice. We were catapulted into the future. Having said that, and that's not going away. I mean, there's still a place for that. We only got half done what we could get done. And so in Brooklyn, at least, I'm encouraging the judges really to get back to in-person appearance. In the mental health court, for example, there's a place for virtual where people are at a program, and we don't have to have the program get them to come to court in a van and wait all day, and so that's okay. But still, it's really irreplaceable to have that human contact of a defendant and defense attorney standing next to each other in the well with the prosecutor before a judge, and that's how cases move, I think. So I see hopeful signs coming out of it that we can reduce the population on Rikers Island by reducing the cases we have in court. And at this point, if I give you a statistic, not to bore you, but our dispositions are outpacing indictments by over 700. So I was fearful at one point in time that we would be up to about 4,000 cases. We're really at about 3,300, where before the pandemic, we were maybe 800, fewer than that. So I think that these are hopeful signs that we can catch up what we lost in the pandemic and start reducing the population on Rikers in this way.
How do judges react to, I know this bothers a lot of jurists, to excessive news, well, a lot of news coverage about a particular decision they made to remand someone or ROR someone who then goes out and does something horrible?
Yeah, I've experienced that myself. So, but I mean, nobody likes it. You know, it makes everybody uncomfortable, but it's part of the job, right? I mean, I always say to the judges, and I say to myself, you can't do, especially when I'm letting people who have pled guilty to a violent felony out into the community in the mental health court, right? So I always say, I can't do this job afraid. I can be careful, and we all should be careful, but if you're afraid, everybody's going to jail, right?
Yes, indeed. I know it's not in the scope of today's conversation, but because it's so important, I did want to ask you, Courtney, when the question comes up of a federal takeover of the jail, it's I think the next hearing, I think the status conference is going to be in November or something like that. What provisions are you making? How are you thinking about that? If that should be the case?
Well, I'll say our organization doesn't have a position officially on that. And, you know, in thinking about what, especially the Center for Court Innovation, what we can be doing, you know, as it relates to keeping people out of Rikers, whether there's a federal takeover or not. In addition to thinking about case delay, I did want to talk about supervised release a little bit.
Absolutely.
And, you know, supervised release was a program designed before bail reform, and it was implemented, and we and a number of folks in this room were part of that, and had a number of successes, has had some challenges as well. Post bail reform, we have, fortunately, in many ways, more people who are coming in to our judges are wanting to and needing to put into supervised release as opposed to Rikers. And we really need to see an investment in the services and resources needed to actually make this program work. It is a different, in many ways, there are people who have greater needs that are coming into the supervised release program citywide, and we need a model and resources to really ensure that we can supervise and support those people effectively. And that should be in place, you know, again, regardless of who's running Rikers Island.
Mm-hmm. Wesley, have you given thought to what a receivership might mean?
Likewise, the Bronx Defenders doesn't have an official position on this. I can tell you, though, that the experiences of the people we serve who are currently incarcerated at Rikers are not good. And whether it's the city's continued control over Rikers or receivership, I think those issues are going to be hard pressed to be resolved without some investment again in opportunities for people to come home and have the support they need to really thrive and to be okay. They cannot get the services and attention they need while incarcerated. Rikers has shown itself not to be capable of that. So likewise, I think it doesn't really matter who's in control. The issues are there, and the issues need to be addressed.
What's it like navigating the jail these days? How have your attorneys found it?
So we have staff, attorneys, social workers, other advocates who actually visit the jail from time to time. The vast majority of our engagement is done via video conferencing. And that could be problematic if we have scheduled video conferences and a facility has some alert that goes out that shuts them down. It means not having those video conferences, which can be very important to both connect with the people we serve and to give them updates on their cases. And, to be at Rikers when an alarm goes off literally can mean being stuck in a particular area for hours and then having to leave without seeing the people we serve. So, currently it's not good. And I think, I welcome that the mayor and this past weekend's convening are having conversation, but I also want to turn back to the fact that this is highly political. And it's a challenge for systems actors to do their jobs well when there's also this external weaponizing of safety and public safety and filtering of public safety through the lens of old tools, carceral systems. And it doesn't allow for a more robust discussion. It doesn't allow for more robust options to be placed on the table because people are afraid of consequences of being in a newspaper or being on a TV program. And with all due respect to Judge Demick, you're a lot stronger than most. Many judges will say, I don't want to be the person who divert this person into an ATI program or supervised release. I'll set bail. And if that person happened to have means and then get bailed out, and then something happens, bail is then attacked on someone who made bail. That's the system even prior to bail reform, right? So the discussion is not very nuanced in the media. And unfortunately, the people with the biggest megaphones are oftentimes the least informed, and the general public just don't have the nuanced understanding of what promotes public safety and what it means to resource communities to really be, frankly, selfish. If you're worried about public safety and if you're proclaiming that you're against mass incarceration, you can't be against closing Rikers. You can't be against resourcing communities. You have to build out the community infrastructure which allows for the decarceration of Rikers and ultimately its closing. They cannot happen independently of each other.
Yeah. Well, let me remind folks, you should write your questions on note cards. There's an intern who will gather them and forward them up here for our panel. And, Richard, it's interesting because you'd almost think sometimes from hearing the conversation that these reforms just dropped in out of the sky, that the supermajority that Democrats have that passed in Albany, that passed a lot of these reforms, they were elected. They debated these things. I moderated some of the debates for Manhattan District Attorney and other offices. These are folks who, they're reformers partly because of what they believe, but also partly because of what their voters wanted them to do. How did the conversation, or why doesn't the conversation reflect that?
Why doesn't it? Yeah, I think there are three words. Crime is up. I think once crime begins to go up, it just changes the equation. When the judge first proposed when Judge Lippman first proposed the commission, we were at record lows. The number of people incarcerated at Rikers was dropping very, very quickly. Don't hold me to the number, but then we get down to like 3,900 at one point. And the commission designed the new plan around that. Crime is going up. We're up over 5,000. We don't have that built into the plan. We're going to have to account for that. There is some question around the bail reform, to just be frank about this. Legislation that's going to impact the public probably has to go through a multi-level test one test is there a compelling need for it? Second is what's the narrative around it? And third, is it legitimate, both procedurally and substantively? There are many people who complain that bail reform happened, quote, in the dead of night. It didn't happen in the dead of night, but it happened so quickly that not all the players in the system were consulted, and that bail reform was sort of thrown into the lap of the public without preparation. It just happened all of a sudden. I think that was a mistake. I think we should have better prepared the public for it, because there are compelling arguments for it. You can't be even near the system and not understand how necessary it is. And I think a greater inclusion of everybody who's involved in the system, all the stakeholders, would have helped with that, and in particular would have helped now when we need everybody saying the same thing, which is, yes, crime is up, but it is absolutely necessary that we close the institution, that we put resources into the communities. There's lots of anecdotal evidence that the VI programs are working now. There's lots of evidence that supervised release is working. There are, in my opinion, I'm sorry, you may disagree, but there are some slight fixes we could make to the bail reform system. But I think as more and more data comes out, we'll see that it's not had a big impact on crime, except for some categories, and we should be willing to address those categories. But we need to get that information out there. Again, we're all ambassadors. We all need to be equipped with that information so that we can be constantly making those arguments, not just to you when we're doing your show or speaking with a reporter, but even when we're speaking with the public. So I think the best response to the crime is up paradigm, which is true. I mean, it's a real problem, is a really, really well-informed group of advocates out there constantly making the same point. In the advocacy world, we call it message discipline. It's safer to keep people out. It's safer to close Rikers. It's safer to have these facilities and communities, et cetera, and be able to state why.
And so
May I add something to that argument? Because I'll add a fifth word, and it's in the room, but we're not actually naming it, and that's race, right? And race is integral to this discussion, not only about mass incarceration, closing Rikers, but also about bail reform. With all due respects, the conversation around the need for bail reform, and that we had this, evolved in this country into a two-tiered system of justice, where wealthy people of means have a different outcome in our courts than does poor people, mostly black and brown people, had been going on for decades. And some of the pushback on how it was and when it was that bail reform actually finally happened in New York has a lot to do with the fact that the Democrats got control of the state Senate, and it happens that the leaders of the state Senate and the leaders of the Assembly are black people. And I think that no one really wants to name that pushback, that while the Republicans had control of the state Senate, there was a lot of very popular bills that were never seeing the light of day because they were obstructionists and did not let it go to the floor to be voted on. Not just bail reform, not just around carceral systems, but a lot of other things that would have benefited communities. And I think that we cannot have this discussion without explicitly saying that the industry, our carceral industry, very much sees black and brown people as the product which flows through them. And unless we can address that, the notion of changing things is always going to have that tinge of race behind a lot of the talking points that you hear in the political theater and also in the media.
Okay. I got a question for you, Mr. Hogan, and then there's some questions from the audience. To the extent that bail reform and other measures were implemented with the end goal of reducing the population at Rikers, a lot fewer people are being held on cash bail for relatively low-level offenses. That means that they're waiting for their day in court out in the community. How has that affected your work? It's a meaningful number statistically, but is that being felt in communities?
Well, it's being felt in a particular way where we can see young people who initially get that second chance, and come out, and we work with them heartily in essence of helping them understand the system, and also for them to identify some of the political things that are created to have them there. We don't shy away from telling young people why they're in this particular position. This is a great country, and what happens when you talked about the product, to be specific, as I said before, a lot of folk get very rich off of poor people, black and brown people. And not to be, and so those that are getting rich, are they going to say, oh, I don't want the money anymore, I'm going to help these people out. I think those are the ones that we have to be more influential over to change this country, because we had all those projects and all those things that were stopped in the Senate. The young people would have felt them if they were allowed to be. But as young people see the leaders, our young people see, they have social media. They see what the leaders of this country do and how they attack one another. So you ask these young kids to act right, and they think about growing older, and all they see is this nonsense and this violence between leadership in our country. So we're allowing false messages to be given to these kids when we say, I know the last debate, you heard a president, someone that was trying to be president, calling the sitting president an idiot and stupid. And I know if I was 5 or 6 years old, I wouldn't want to be the president, because I would think that I would be stupid. So how many things that we're allowing, for young people to be exposed to them? And this is what the problem is. No one addresses what's happening to the young people. You see the cop walking, the street, past a little kid, 5, 6 years old, in the head, say, I'll get hugs. Believe me, I do this, I see through this every day. 3 more years, this cop is chasing the kid. So was there a real relationship building up in that community with that cop and that child? Or was this cop just waiting? And I don't think the cop was just waiting. But I think that the system pushes this kid to believe that there's nothing else for him to do besides become incarcerated. And just finishing, I was speaking to a young brother yesterday, and he was telling me his problems he was having. He's 21 years old. He's changed a lot. And then he started crying and said he believes that some people should be incarcerated. And he said, namely himself. And that's how convincing this system has been. This functioning young brother believes that he should be incarcerated, as opposed to looking for help that he knows he's not going to see, because help is never visible. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to, in the interest of time, we're going to do what I call a jump ball. I'll just put the question out there. Anybody can grab it. Has New York City considered utilizing co-responder or mobile crisis models in support of community-based interventions rather than carceral processing?
I think we are. I think the NYPD has a co-response mechanism with a group of social workers, I don't know, under a very good chief, and that's beginning. It comes out of a model from LAPD, and it's actually a very effective intervention. It keeps people who are trained in the psychological aspects of some of these incidents in the front. While there is some public safety backup, these things can go bad, but it's a far, far, far smarter way to handle these sorts of incidents.
But yeah, that project's been going on for a couple of years now. I just read about a similar one in Chicago that seemed to get some good reviews, and the one in Eugene, Oregon is very well known. Please address the housing needs of this population, many homeless people in Rikers.
I'll just offer that I think that immediate access for supportive housing and community-based mental health treatment are some of the greatest needs and reasons why people remain in jail, either pretrial or instead of an alternative to incarceration sentence.
And I'll echo that too. I mean, the hardest problem I have getting people out, we try not to use the shelter system because people with serious mental illness don't always do well, but supportive housing, transitional housing is something that's sorely needed.
Yeah.
Errol, just want to say one thing. Affordable housing, it's the extreme oxymoron. Okay? Let's get that in our mind, first of all. When we deal with gun violence, and there are so many mothers that lose their sons or daughters to gun violence in the city, and within 2 months, those parents who weren't homeless become homeless. So then when you talk about illness and wellness, you talk about the trauma that's impacted into our communities. it immediately impacts and is connected. And we have to recognize that if we told people 5 years ago that we're going to raise the minimum wage to $15.70, but they already knew in line that would raise their rent, I mean, it's a game, but people was believing and loving the $15 an hour, not thinking about their rent was going up. We have to man up and woman up and come together and say, all right, the game's over. Let's stop killing these people. Let's stop lying to these people. Let's make this a better country. Let's try to work together. And if we're offended by us having opposing ideals or situations, let's work those out.
Okay, that is going to be the last word for this panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. For the next segment of the program, we're turning to the discussion of the new facilities and civic considerations related to the borough-based jails. I'm going to ask and welcome our next speaker, New York City Comptroller, Brad Lander. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon, yeah. All right. Good afternoon. Try that again. Thank you. Thank you to all the sponsors for bringing this group together today to discuss this topic, which is so urgent and yet which we so often fail to see. While our city has so many challenges at the moment, and indeed quite a few that can appropriately be labeled crises, perhaps none tests the limits of government bureaucracy or reflects the short-sightedness of traditional policy responses more than what is happening inside New York City's jails. I also want to thank CUNY's John Jay College for hosting us today, because if there is a New York City institution that is the antithesis of Rikers, that offers us hope that a government institution could actually offer our young people across lines of race, class, neighborhood, a genuine opportunity to achieve their dreams and live free and full lives, it is the City University of New York. So it's both poignant and appropriate to be having this conversation here. And thank you for including me in it. That's worth clapping for. All right. CUNY, come on. If we can't clap for CUNY, we're really in trouble as a city. So, all right, thank you. When I assumed office as New York City Controller in January, our office had just, under the prior controller, issued its annual report showing that the yearly cost to detain a single person in custody at Rikers Island was now well over $500,000 per year. That's, vastly in excess on the nightly basis of the most expensive hotel that you could find in New York City. And yet, conditions in our jails had deteriorated so badly that a state of emergency had been declared in response to excessive staff absenteeism and spiking violence. As you know, the Federal Monitor declared it chaos, a culture of brutality for $500,000 a year. A nightmare that had been developing over decades has been exacerbated by the pandemic into a full-scale emergency. So it was a top priority for us in the Controller's Office to understand exactly what was happening at Rikers and how it could be addressed, and to provide as much information as we possibly can to the public for this critical discussion. So Commissioner Molina was the very first agency commissioner that I met with as controller. And to his and his team's credit, they were able to work with us to set up a data sharing agreement that gave the Comptroller's Office access to staffing data on a weekly basis, which had not been being released publicly before. Because of its public value and our commitment to greater public transparency around DOC operations, that data is now available to everyone for download on our website. And we've actually just posted our most recent monthly update today. And those numbers have been for the entirety of this time, and they remain deeply troubling. The monthly number of slashings is 22% higher than the same period a year ago, and 318% higher than 2019, when there were far more people in custody. The share of staff out sick has remained for the past 4 months at 12%, and the share of medically restricted staff at 8%, both unchanged over the past 3 months and double their pre-pandemic levels. For the number, for example, of missed medical appointments was up slightly this month, 9,259 compared to 8,914. That statistical data, of course, pales in comparison to what we're reading in Lost Lives. Just this past weekend, Eric Tavira died in a mental health observation unit in jail on Rikers Island. He was the 17th person to die just this year and the 33rd since January of 2021. Board of Corrections investigations of the 16 deaths in custody last year found that in at least 10 of those 16 deaths, there was some type of correction officer lapse or failure. Now, there are many DOC staff at Rikers Island working in good faith to improve conditions for the people in their custody, but these repeated failures, not to mention the recent conduct of some correction officers towards sitting members of the city council in full view of the press at a council hearing, raises serious questions about the ability of this or any commissioner or mayor to bring about the changes, the culture shift that are necessary to keep everyone there safe, detainees and staff alike. And that is why, with some trepidation, I have come to the conclusion that a receiver should be appointed to confront the deeply entrenched mismanagement of staff and union leadership recalcitrance at Rikers Island. Now look, a receiver will not be able to magically fix what is broken at Rikers and has been for decades, but a receiver would be empowered to cut through some of the legal, regulatory, and other barriers, hiring policies, staff assignment practices, sick leave, procurement, that have contributed to the emergency and that the city has failed to adequately contend with for many years. And I thank the folks in this room who have paved the way on this and taught me about it. And again, with some hesitation, but I have now firmly concluded that this is the direction that for the near term the city needs to go in. Now, receivership should not be confused as a fix for what is broken at Rikers. So while we must address the immediate and inescapably real safety threats to both those individuals in custody and on staff, we cannot lose focus on the hard but necessary work to close Rikers Island. And that's why I appreciate having this conversation today here with many of the people who began and developed it. The decision to close Rikers did not come lightly or easily. It was won through a years-long campaign of extensive organizing led by formerly incarcerated individuals, developed through the policy work of the Lippman Commission, and then through extensive deliberation by the City Council and the Mayor. It was not easy for the city to reach the decision that substantial and continued decarceration was both possible and necessary, or to decide to build 4 new borough-based jails to replace Rikers. But the council adopted the plan, and I voted for it, speaking personally, because we concluded that it was the best way to reduce the number of people needlessly awaiting trial in jail, and that conditions on Rikers are too abominable to allow the facility to remain open. It was the right decision then, and it remains the right decision today. Unfortunately, there are few signs that at the moment the city is headed in the direction of the path that we voted as a city to adopt. We are not presently on the path of decarceration to reduce the jail population to 3,500, and I have deep concerns that we're not on the path to build the 4 borough-based jails by 2027, so today's conversation is a critical one. Based on its review of historical trends, as many of you know, and the material that's in your packets today, the Lippman Commission established a target capacity of 3,500 for the city jails by 2027. From a high of nearly 20,000 2 decades ago, the number of detainees has come down steadily for the past 15 years, while crime also dropped dramatically, and it dipped below 4,000 down to 3,800 at the beginning of the pandemic. Unfortunately, as of October 2nd, the jail population is back up at 5,849, some 2,500 above the capacity of the planned borough-based jails, and up 5% from just a year ago. One example, the city sentence population, something that's fully within the power of the city of New York, is up 400%. It was 100 people a year ago. It's 400 today, while the pretrial population remains above 5,000. So first, we can and must focus on the continued path of decarceration. On average, there are more than 1,000 people, about 20% of the folks who are there, who have been diagnosed with serious mental illness. Rikers is de facto, we allow it to be the largest mental health facility in the city of New York, despite the fact that we know that no one is going to get better there, that no one is going to have their mental health needs addressed there, that no one is going to come out more healthy than they were. So that's 1,000 of those 5,000 folks that we know there are so many better options for. And I'll give you just one more example. I was on Rikers about 6 weeks ago, and amongst the facilities I visited was Rose M. Singer, or Rosie's, designated for women and non-binary folks in detention. On the day I was there, there were 339 people in custody. I didn't get to speak to all of them, but I spoke to several dozen of them. They were mostly there on charges, drug charges, on shoplifting. I did not talk to one person who I concluded really needed to be detained in jail awaiting trial. As you heard on the previous panel, with the right mix of supportive housing, drug treatment, workforce development, case management, those folks could be awaiting trial in their communities in ways dramatically better for them, dramatically better for their families, and less expensive than detaining them on Rikers Island at that $500,000 cost that we are currently spending per year. So that's on the decarceration side. Meanwhile, and this is the transition to the next panel, I worry that the plans for the 4 borough-based jails are at risk of being stalled for reasons that you can read about in the news almost every day. Now look, there are, and you're about to discuss, important civic considerations surrounding the locations, the process, engagement, size, design, and cost of the plan. Now, those civic considerations were worthy of attention, and they got quite a lot of it when the Close Rikers folks launched the campaign to close Rikers in 2016. And those civic considerations were worthy of extensive attention, and they got it through the 2 years of deliberation of the Lippman Commission between 2016 and 2018. Those civic considerations were worthy of consideration, and they got it when the City Council voted to adopt the Close Rikers plan in 2019. So they remain relevant today, but we must not lose sight of this civic consideration. We cannot continue to lock growing numbers of our neighbors away, out of sight, to await their fair day in court in crumbling facilities, home to a culture of impunity and brutality. So, look, we can and must get back on the path to close Rikers, to shutter the jail facilities there once and for all. We've done all this work together to develop that plan. It is a sound one. It is worth all of the conversations about how we move it forward. They are hard and not easy questions, but that plan is our North Star. I thank everyone who fought for it, and I promise you to keep working alongside you until we get there. Thank you.
All right, that was a great segue from the controller, so thank you for introducing our next panel here. My name is David Brand. I am deputy editor at the news site City Limits. Before becoming a staff member at City Limits, I was editor at the Queens Daily Eagle, and so I was neck deep and a lot of reporting and discussions and debates over the borough-based jails plan, especially as it affected Queens. And so I think this is a great opportunity to revisit some of the nuts and bolts of the plan, the current progress, as Controller mentioned, and where things stand. So as Errol mentioned in the first panel, there are QR codes located around the room that you can scan to learn more about the panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly in a second, but also want to remind audience members to please write questions on the note cards you have, and a student will come around and collect those during the question and answer portion of the panel. That's going to be in about 30 minutes. So thank you for that. So let's introduce our panelists. Starting off, we have Councilmember Lincoln Ressler, who represents a 33rd Council District covering much of Northeast Brooklyn, including the site of the new Brooklyn jail that's in progress. We have Kendra Clark, who is Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Exodus Transitional Services, reentry services provider. She's also a member of the Queens Neighborhood Advisory Council. Gilly Delgado is an organizer and a violence interrupter with Guns Down, Life Up. He's a member of the Bronx Neighborhood Advisory Council. And we have Dana Kaplan, who is Senior Advisor to the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, the Lippman Commission. She's formerly the Deputy Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. So, Dana, I want to start with you because a lot has happened in the past 3 years. And as Controller Lander said, there's concern that the jails plan is not going to meet the timeline. So where are we at now? And if you can just provide some basics remind us where the jails are located and what the current state of construction is.
Sure. So it is an honor to be here today, and incredibly, I think we made the note that we are at the 5-year point from when there was this incredible commitment from the city of New York to commit to closing the jails on Rikers Island. But we are basically exactly at the 3-year mark since the city council approved the land use action to create the 4 borough facilities and then the related off-site hospital beds. And, you know, a lot has happened in the last 5 years, including a global pandemic that happened, you know, just shortly after actually that city council vote. So a little bit of just the basic facts. The council, former mayor, and in conjunction with so many people in this room and the input of just, when I say hundreds of individuals, I do not exaggerate, maybe thousands of people into the plan. It outlined the contours of 4 borough-based facilities in every borough but Staten Island that would replace the jails on Rikers Island. 3 of them in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, and in Queens on the site of where there is existing borough facilities, and then the 4th on the site of an NYPD tow pound set to replace the barge, because I think we also all understand that a boat is not part of the justice reform considerations of the city of New York. Now, since the ULURP vote happened, the city moved ahead to begin the process of these 4 facilities. And so where things stand today at this point is that all 4 projects are underway. Dismantling and site prep at all 4 sites is in progress. And the first project in Queens, which is a related parking facility, will be completed in the next few months. The Department of Design and Construction has brought on, you know, a whole team to work on this, including community construction liaisons that are, you know, interfacing and engaging with the neighborhoods that are impacted, providing updates at community board meetings, you know, sharing information with the neighborhood advisory councils. The work has proceeded. And I really do actually want to just appreciate the incredible amount of, you know, there's a huge team, particularly at the Department of Design and Construction, and people at DOC and CHS and the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice that are working incredibly hard on this project every day. I think we can also be very clear-eyed about what the challenges are. And so, as I said, there's an incredible challenge that they faced immediately in the fact that there was a global pandemic. And so the project became delayed by 6 months, really essentially before it even got off the ground. And so, that is still, the timeline is a challenge. There's also, of course, the challenge of inflation. We have inflation of everything. We feel it in our pockets when we go to the grocery store. So obviously, and inevitably and unfortunately, the cost of these facilities is going to be higher. I do want to thank the Institute of State and Local Governance, which did, that analysis that Judge Lippman spoke about earlier, that really contextualized this, and that yes, the cost of these facilities are going to be higher. The cost of rebuilding on Rikers would be higher. The cost of staying on Rikers is higher, and that the cost savings that we will realize at the completion of these facilities are also something that can still be captured, and that the status quo of $500,000 a day to keep people on Rikers Island right now is something that's unacceptable. Now, and I won't take up too much time, but I'll just, a few of the other challenges, and I think that this is, of course, what this panel is the challenge of how do we make sure that these facilities and these buildings actually get us towards the type of transformed justice system that we want to see. And I'm very glad that today, in the ULURP, we had to spend months talking about the buildings. Today, this is actually the shortest panel. The longest panels are on how do we reduce the jail population and improve public safety, and how do we change the culture of the facilities. The buildings are just one piece. However, the design of these buildings is an incredibly important component of that total puzzle. And so, at the same time that DDC and the city are responsible for delivering this massive design build capital works project on time, they also are tasked with understanding how can they create safety and dignity and humanity in these facilities for correctional officers and for staff, and how can this design support the culture change? And that's no little thing. And then, of course, we have a responsibility to make sure that we are responding to the neighborhood concerns. And I'm sure we'll hear just some of them. There remain lots of neighborhood concerns. And I think that, we have, as a city, there's $400 million of commitments from the points of agreement that we certainly need to make sure are responded to. But we do have to ensure that these are buildings that are good neighbors. And I think sometimes people talk about them as civic assets. And I want to actually give credit to Liz Gaines, who in one of our early meetings said, a jail is not a civic asset per se, right? Like, we can agree that jails are not necessarily something that we in our society want, but these should be good neighbors, and they should deliver the best civic good. And that's dignity to people who are inside them, who staff them every day. And we do have a responsibility to address those basic quality of life issues that we heard from Chinatown, from Kew Gardens, from Mott Haven to downtown Brooklyn, everything from the impact of construction on seniors to the traffic, the Sallyport entrances. I know Justin Pollock is in the room, and he can talk a lot about just the needs and concerns about traffic impact in downtown Brooklyn. All of these things we have to take seriously, and we have to fire on all these cylinders. And so it's, we've got 5 years to get this right.
Well, let's talk about those. You mentioned being clear-eyed about the challenges, about the community pushback, community resistance, community concerns. So, Kendra, I want to start with you. You've spent time in jail, in prison. You've been a vocal advocate for closing Rikers and for pursuing the borough-based jails plan. You're also a member of the Queens Neighborhood Advisory Committee. So what are the community concerns, and how are you addressing those?
Yeah, so I think I'll definitely start with just sharing a little bit of my personal story. Growing up, I grew up in domestic violence, didn't know my biological father. My mom had serious mental illness. She died at the age of 46 from cirrhosis. Incarceration was normal, right? That was common. And so I have been incarcerated all across this country in very small rural communities where there was 6 women total to Rikers Island, Cook County. And what Brad Lander said earlier about how he was just at Rosie's and he didn't meet a single woman that he thought that should have been there. Well, guess what? My whole life in all of those facilities, I've never met a single woman that should have been there. So I just want to preface that, right? There's a lot of people that don't even know why they're there, and discovery packets are important for that. I worked as a law clerk. I know what it's like inside when you've been convicted and you don't even know what it's for, right? So, this work has been very personal for me. In addition to being on the neighborhood advisory, committee. I'm also on the Queen's peer review team for the borough-based facility as well. And I think, throughout the entire time, and this has been years, I can't tell you how many community meetings I've been to. So when I hear people say that there hasn't been enough discourse on it, I'm personally blown away because I'm like, what are you talking about? We've spent literally years discussing this in these meetings. And it is really disheartening. We just had a NAC meeting maybe 2 months ago, not that long ago. And they were still bringing up the same complaints, right? That their garden's not going to be able to grow as good because the building is going to be too tall, right? And it's going to block the sunlight from their garden, so their plants are not going to be able to grow. And for me, being formerly incarcerated, it's kind of hard to be in those situations when we're talking about people dying and you're worried about your garden, right? So I don't think that there's a comparison there. I think that we also need to stand up and be bold. And when we see people, NIMBYism is usually a disguise for racism, let's be real, right? And this has been an ongoing conversation. So while I agree that we need to have conversations with the community and come to commonalities and agreements, we also have to stand bold and really stand up for what's right and what's fair, right? And not worry about all of those things. So my personal, work is really trying to get the community members to understand that we are human beings. I've heard 3 different people use the term inmate up here. That's part of the problem. That's dehumanizing. It takes the humanity away from someone, and that's why we are allowed to treat people that way inside, right? And we're even doing that on these kind of panels. So we still have a long way to go, and I think it's really trying to, when I first moved into my building, no one knew I was formerly incarcerated, and now I have most of my building members in my apartment building on Black Lives Matters panels and, out on social media and advocating for Close Rikers because we got to have those discussions. And then I think the people that, are still adamant NIMBY folks, it's usually tied to racism, and you're just never going to win. So we need to stand up and be bold and say, hey, this is what's right, and keep pushing for that.
Thank you. Gilly, I want to hear about your experience in the Bronx and what you're hearing from residents, because I know there's a lot of different perspectives, and among those perspectives is opposition because people wanted affordable housing there. Recognizing that this project is moving forward, so what is it going to take to make sure the community gets what it needs in this process?
Thank you, and thank you everybody in here. So first off, my name is Gilly Delgado. I work for the program called Guns Down Life Up Lincoln Hospital, where we track all the gunshot, assault, and stab wounds that go on in that vicinity and throughout New York City. Also, we're part of the crisis management system, and we're also part of Health and Hospital, 55 Water Street. So, we service New York City. The location where the jail wants to be built, it's actually a neutral location in the Bronx, because it's really east. So when you start working your way west, and I'm meaning immediately around that corner, that's off of Southern Boulevard and Bruckner, but when you make that right, you wind up on 139 and Brook Avenue. It's very high risk and high impact with a lot of drugs, guns, a lot of things go on just immediately around that corner. So it's gonna be a work in progress, but I think it will work due to the fact that it's on the very east side. And we just need more community board organizations. I hear saying $500,000 per inmate. Well, that's what it costs to fund a CBO program. So if you get more brothers like my colleagues in the back, Mr. Real and Mr. Mata, which, Mr. Mata just, came home from a very long stint in the penitentiary, but he's so influential in the communities that we hired him so we meet the high-risk individual where they are, right? So instead of paying $500,000 an inmate, we need to help CBO organizations, or like us in the hospital, where we have a reentry program. We have all the resources in the hospital, from mental health, We have all the departments in there, from maintenance all the way to the science, all the way to biology, where we can actually build programs to help our inner city kids instead of just continue to build basketball courts and football fields. Like, let's open up biological centers so we could attack COVID properly and know the language of what's being attacked in our communities all day long. So it's a double-edged sword with me, but I believe it'll work. It's in progress, but we need to allocate those dollars. And like the sister said, an inmate, I mean, just break it down. You're in and you have a mate, right? So it's an inmate. So, and it's not likely, it's not productive jail. Like Rikers Island, in the 70s and 80s, it was something that you'd be like, wow, nobody wants to go to Rikers, right? Now, Rikers Island is New York City. It's outdoors now. So everybody, the language, the verbiage in the street on social media, they look forward to it. Like the brother said earlier, it's a game to these kids because, one, the bail reform, the YO, the youthful offender, they know that if they, excuse my expression, but if they shoot or, like we say, they hit or clap somebody, they'll be right out on the street as a YO. And then by the time they're 18 years old, it gets erased. So what are we doing to rehabilitate our black and brown people, right? But we all in it as a whole, because I don't only see black and brown people in here. I see also white people that care about New York City. So again, it's a double-edged sword with me. I think it's ideal, but the location, we really have to look around the whole area of that location, because as you turn the corner, you have Brook Avenue, Cypress Avenue, Beekman Terrace. I could go on names and names, and that's really high risk and high impact.
Thank you. Councilman Ressler, I want to hear the community concerns in your district, especially around the jail, but also addressing what Mr. Delgado brought up about balancing community needs with construction and the citywide need for the jail.
Thank you, David, and really it's an honor to be here with each of these great panelists, and Brad is always the toughest act to follow, so thank you for your leadership. And I really want to thank the Littman Commission and Judge Littman in particular, and Zach and Dana for the tremendous work that they're doing. And it's great to be at John Jay with Erica Bond. I think between Erica and Dana, the very little I know about the subject of closing Rikers and DOC, I've learned from the two of you. So thank you for being great colleagues in the administration that we worked in together. And want to thank two of our great former commissioners at DOC, in Vinny and Mike. Thank you for the work you do and that you continue to do. And thank the current administration for being here, and Brendan and Betsy, and in engaging in this conversation. I had the privilege of working in the previous administration, and I remember like it was yesterday when we rushed the mayor out to shake hands with Corey Johnson, because we had 4 council members who were willing to approve expanded jails in their district. And in all of the years, the tremendous advocates, and the Close Rikers campaign deserves all the credit in the world for making this happen, but all the advocates who pushed and pushed and pushed to close Rikers, I would have said the hardest part would have been to get 4 council members to approve a ULURP in their district that they were going to have larger jails. And we had Steve Levin and Karen Koslowitz and Margaret Chin and Diana Ayala out there ready to go. And we got through that. And I led many of the briefings internally at City Hall to bring the mayor along and to keep that process going. And now we should be on a glide path. And unfortunately, it's hard to tell exactly where we are. David Dinkins, Rudy Giuliani, Mike Bloomberg, and Bill de Blasio, there aren't too many things that you can say that bring them all together. But over these 30 years, all 4 of them saw a reduction in incarceration and a reduction in crime during their administrations. And we need this mayor to step up and help us and partner in the same ways to keep driving the population down at Rikers Island. If we're going to be able to build these 4 new jails in our communities, we need to make the efforts to use the bully pulpit to bring together the leaders across the criminal justice system to drive down the incarcerated population in New York City. We can absolutely do it safely. We have done it for 30 years, and we need to do it now. The issues in Brooklyn, I think are all solvable. Any big construction project is an unpleasant thing for neighbors. So for the people who live in the immediate proximity to the downtown Brooklyn jail, or in Kew Gardens, or in the South Bronx or Lower Manhattan, there's there's going to be issues. But what I can say is that we've seen a lot of construction in downtown Brooklyn, and we know how to work through those issues. We know how to bring the key stakeholders together, have regular communication, make sure that we're addressing traffic issues, we're addressing noise issues, that we're thinking through design. We do have really smart and engaged neighbors who I know will continue to be great partners in addressing these issues, because we have a moral imperative to close Rikers Island. It has to happen. I do want to close in just saying this. I visited Rikers this Monday. I went to GRVC, and in my many visits to Rikers, I've never seen such squalor. Water that had been sitting there for weeks, taking up half of a housing unit, garbage strewn everywhere, food tossed everywhere. I talked to detainee after detainee who was having multiple strip searches a day. And the thing that I couldn't understand is that these folks in a general population housing unit were being kept in their teeny cells for 17 hours a day as a result of new DOC policy. That does not improve access to mental health programs. That does not address the core needs of the people who are on Rikers Island. It makes things worse. And it is a policy that we need to reverse. And I think that as we work forward to design and implement these new jails, we can address the failures of Rikers Island. We can provide more humane designs that ensure light and air and space for programming and common areas that, frankly, in the dilapidated and decrepit, Rikers Island just is very, very hard to do. Right now we have, I think at GRVC, there's no hot water today. There's no heat today. There's another facility that, similarly, I think there was a pipe that burst. And these things happen. Rikers Island is falling apart. But it is awful conditions for the people on Rikers Island. And we have to just center it there, that for the nearly 6,000 people, and we are now back up to almost 6,000 people, for the almost 6,000 people on Rikers Island, we have to move forward with this plan. We have to close Rikers Island. We have to get these new facilities built.
You talk about the awful conditions, and we hear the horror stories. We've seen the photos that Gothamist published after getting them from the Board of Corrections of really horrifying, disgusting things happening there. In his opening comments, Darren Mack called it a 400-acre penal colony where more than 90% of detainees are people of color. There's a toxic culture. So, Kendra, how is opening these facilities going to help change the culture?
Sure, and I want to definitely premise this on the fact that New York City actually experienced this trip, right? So we have all of this information. Back in 2019, the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, the Department of Corrections, and I think 5 of us activists got to go to Norway and Amsterdam to tour correctional facilities in Norway and Amsterdam. Now, I'm an abolitionist at heart. So when I got invited to this trip, there was no way you could have told me that I would actually think that there was a jail that worked, right? I'm like, oh yeah, they're saying all these good things. They teach people how to be good neighbors. It's this whole different model. I'll believe it when I see it, right? I was blown away, right? So back in the 70s, 80s, Europe had the same issues that we have. High suicide rates, mass violence, people were not treated with dignity. Their parliament created a white paper, implemented it through their government that mandated all of these different changes to happen. And the changes were really centered around justice and dignity and humanity for everyone, right? So these are maximum security facilities, folks. We're not talking about Rikers. Rikers is a place that people are held when they haven't been convicted yet, okay? Or they get sentenced for a misdemeanor, a very low-level crime. I'm talking about maximum security facilities. First, in Norway, the maximum sentence you can ever get, no matter what you do, is 21 years, right? They do not believe in life sentences. On your first day coming in, they'll basically kind of put you on the work order with folks and trust you with knives, chainsaws even, because they have to go cut wood from the forest, right? So totally different, than how we look at here. And, different things that they do there, staff, correctional officers, have to go through 2 years of educational training, including social work school, and they have to take an ethics exam and pass that exam in order to be hired as a correctional officer. In fact, most of their correctional officers are clergy or social workers. So they do more of like a mentoring kind of component. It's like almost coaching that they get paired with the incarcerated people. Now, I know people can say, oh, it's only happening there because it's more of a homogenous country. So my question here is, because most of our incarcerated population is Black and brown, that's why we're choosing not to follow this model? Because there's no other excuse of why New York City can't follow these types of models, right? The buildings did play a huge role in the process, right? Because the design of the building was outfitted with technology, so staff, officers didn't have to escort people anywhere. You had your daily schedule that you were supposed to do, and it was inputted into the computer, so the doors would only open if that was a door that you were supposed to go through to go to your program. Most thing that blew my mind, and this is what I think we really need to get to when we're talking about these borough-based facilities, they talked a lot about teaching you how to be good neighbors. The last third of your sentence, you worked in the community. The second third of your sentence, you got trained, certified in transferable skills that counted towards the outside. Again, that's something in America we don't do. We don't give people certifications that they can actually come home and get jobs with, because our certifications don't count from the inside compared to the outside. So nothing's transferable. So the last third of your sentence, you are actually working in the community. If you were out sick for that day, the community member would come and say, oh my gosh, where's so-and-so? This is an incarcerated person that they're talking about, right? So the entire community is involved in it. The employers, they use this thing called the import model. DOC does not have all power. The employers that are training folks and then hiring them, they oversee all of the training programs. The public library oversees their public library. I was blown away at the library that they had in there. Most of the books are blacklisted for us in America. You can't even get books half the time, right? Because everything, if it's too empowering, we don't let folks have it, right? So everything is about taking agency away when you're talking about America. We can't even have pictures hanged up or our own clothes, anything like that. They had their own rooms and keys in Norway and Amsterdam, okay? And we visited, we toured, I took a whole notebook of notes and have created a PowerPoint that I have shared with everyone in this city, and still, nothing has been talked about how we're going to do that with these borough-based facilities, right? So I think that is an administration failure, because we have the information that we need to be able to do it. We just need to be able to implement it. And the culture was so different. The entire ferry system was ran by people who were incarcerated at that moment. The supervisor to every staff. There was no guards there at all. And this is maximum security facilities. So again, I think when we're thinking through this process of these borough-based facilities, those principles and models have to get, some of them at least have to get embedded in. You know, when you look at the job description for a Department of Corrections officer here, it is all about the officers. It is all about safety and control. It has nothing to do with actually keeping the people who they're supposed to be serving safe, right? It is completely backwards. And when you look at the job descriptions from Norway and Amsterdam, it's all about how we can treat people with humanity, how we can make sure that they're good neighbors upon their release, so they're not coming back through these doors and having recidivism. Their recidivism rate as a country is lower than 20%. Come on, like, we know that this stuff works, so if we're choosing to ignore it, then that's a failure on us. So that's really what I've been pushing for these borough-based facilities. On the peer review team, I put in thousands of comments with DDC and really tried to educate folks and, you know, hold true to those values and models, but we can definitely do that here.
And
Can I-
just a sec, I just want to remind people to put questions on the index cards, and someone's going to come around and take them in the next few minutes. But yeah, Dana.
Yeah, I just wanted to build off of that, because of course, you know, and when people were looking at the European facilities, it's again, the question of culture and the question of the physical building are, you know, two important integrated questions that are not one and the same, but both have, you know, an incredibly essential role. The physical components that I think people took away is, you know, there are these members of the design review committee, like Kendra, like others, like I think DDC is actually even working with some European architects to provide input in. And they did do, you know, a very good job of trying to ensure that the design principles that they have put together to inform these borough facilities, you know, have that lens. You know, a lot of the different kind of actual components, more room for for a programming space, right? More room on the actual housing units for programming space, more room for health clinics, smaller housing units, better sight lines. Like those are all the types of things that, a more dignified and, people use the word normative environment a lot, and I think that that's an important word. I do want to acknowledge there was an interesting research study that just came out about, interviews with a lot of people who had spent time in some of these model Norwegian facilities. And, what they concluded was that it was a fundamentally less brutal and less violent place certainly than Rikers, but, than what is unfortunately just kind of the, standard operating procedures for too many American correctional facilities. So it was fundamentally less brutal, it was less violent. People didn't have those same types of concerns about just daily safety. That is incredibly important, right? And those things like sightlines and smaller housing units are essential to that. They did also talk about the fact that deprivation of liberty is still highly punitive, right? So we do not, it's not that we are romanticizing the fact that if people are deprived of their liberty and incarcerated in any facility, that is a punishment. We are trying to reduce the size of the jail population with the recognition that there are so many people that do not need to be incarcerated at all, and that is why we're planning for a smaller system, right? So that deprivation of liberty, even in the best environment, is punishment. And so, both of those things can be true. That even for people in these model, facilities that seem aspirational to us, that deprivation of liberty still is deeply felt, and that's something that we can't take lightly, right? So it's not that these are not college campuses that people are choosing to go to. However, the fundamental experience of feeling less at risk and in danger every single day and having access to programs and not having, and having the dignity of the people who work there as well be something that is clear is absolutely that's something that we should emulate. And, and I don't think that we should ever in New York City look at a system and say, that's too good, we can't do that, right? We are planning for what is the system, what do we want to see in New York City? In some ways, the fact that this is like a 10-year plan is the challenge. In other ways, it is the opportunity. Because if we cannot get this once in a lifetime opportunity to transform this system in what I personally feel is the greatest city in the world, if we can't get it right here, that is just, we should accept no less for any of us.
And I just got one more quick thing to add, because I'd be remiss if I didn't say it. In these European models, solitary confinement is basically non-existent, okay? They use de-escalation techniques like the rest of us use an alternative to incarceration programs, which is the same exact population that DOC serves. So again, coming up with these excuses after excuses after excuses of why things can't be done is not acceptable.
I don't know if there's any index card questions out there, and we just have about a minute left, but I want to pose one more question. This is to Gilly and to Councilman Ressler. The opposition to the jails plan, I think, is reflective of, broader opposition to any type of program or housing or temporary transitional housing for justice-involved New Yorkers, people who have coming from jails and prison or have spent time. We see that with the Just Home project on the campus of Jacobi Hospital right now. So, Gilly, how do you see that opposition, and how do you see that being overcome so that people leaving jail, leaving prison, or who have that in their past can get permanent housing?
That's a good question, but, we focus on that at Guns Down Life Up, so, we meet, the individual where they're at. So as far as when they're coming out of jail as well, we have a reentry program. We have court mandates and probation and parole mandates where, we walk them throughout the whole system just to, get them used to society again. Because if you're incarcerated at 2015 and you come home in 2022, you come home with the mentality of 2015 because you sat back. So you don't know what's going on out here today. A lot of my brothers and sisters that come home, they more nervous of being in the street than than to being incarcerated. So it's just two different worlds. So, you know, what we do is you know, we walk them through, also like they're saying, like, in the jail system, there's no more trades. There used to be plumbing and all type of trades with CDL courses, and when they come home to absolutely nothing. So it's like, oh, you know, they're afraid to start over. So what they do is they'll go back to their norm, which is being in the street, selling drugs, you know, robbing people, stealing people. 'Cause that's something that it never left their system while they were in jail. Because once you're in jail, you're on survival mode 24 hours a day. You have no time to think about, what am I going to do when I get out of here? You're thinking all day, how am I going to eat? You know, there's nothing for them. So what we do at Guns Down Life, we hold their hand all the way through. There's a lot of alternatives. You know, there's different programming that we walk them through, and we stick with them all the way throughout. Talking about housing, you know, housing is just for city and state workers right now. You have to go through a shelter system, and the shelter system is supposed to only be 4 months, but there's people that stay there for 4 years, right? And when they're in there, the shelter system is no different from Rikers Island. It's the same drill. It's the same drill. You got people robbing your food, stealing your food, kicking your door down. So a lot of people, that's why there's a lot of homeless people in the street, because they figured, like, I'm not going to go through a double Rikers Island. I'm not going to come out of Rikers Island to go into a shelter system where the people that work these systems, like they said earlier, they really don't care. They just care that I'm getting my 9 to 5. I hear people say my paycheck don't change. Whether I help you or not, my paycheck don't change. Right? So, you know, there's a lot of things we need to step to and really focus on. Then while we're focusing on why are we closing Rikers Island, so we could say we could close Rikers Island all day and open up these little jails around the boroughs. But what are we doing around the vicinity of those jails? You know, are there more jobs? You know, are we able to close down all these a lot of delis? There's like 5 delis on one corner in my neighborhood. There's no necessity for 5 delis on one corner. Or, you know, how do we, you know, help the inmate, help the high populated kid with the buyback gun program, right? I'm sorry, I'm just drifting, right? But you want a kid to bought a gun for $400, but you'll give him $250 for his gun, instead of talking to the Wall Street executives and say, well, Apple stock is only $149. Let's give these kids 2 stocks and watch their money grow. And I guarantee you that kid would only not be on his phone looking at IG, but he will watch his money grow and he'll buy more stock.
Yeah, thank you. And we have to leave it there because we're about to wrap up, but I do want to get to at least one community question. No, I think, no, that was, thank you for.
See, I speak for the community. I'm here for the hood, which is used to be called neighborhood, but we took the neighbor out the hood, so we only focus on the hood, and then it becomes a norm. So after we all go home here today, a lot of us got to go back into the hood and help that high-risk individual where he stands and prevent him from going to jail. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Judge.
All right, we got a lot of great questions here, but I think I'm going to do what Errol did and call this a jump ball, and whoever wants to take this, and then we're going to wrap it up for the evening. But so this is a question from the audience. This audience believes that Rikers must be closed, but it is divided on the idea that New York City should spend $12 billion on new jails that increase capacity to cage people. $12 billion. Is this the best use? Convince us.
You don't want me to go. It's not, you know, but like I said earlier, it's a double-edged sword. But with those $12 billion, there's a lot that we could do, like the sister said, with, you know, with everything that she saw in Europe. And maybe we could, you know, implement that over here in New York City, because New York City is the capital of the world, right? So without New York, the world is nothing. So I think so.
I want Lincoln to be, it's not that I want him to catch that jump ball, but I want to make sure that he has another chance to speak. I do want to just clarify, it is not to increase the capacity. So I think that is something that often gets misunderstood, is that we are planning for a smaller capacity, and that is because we're planning for something that is it is part of an entire reform of the system, right? It is not just about new jails. And so that that focus about this is not an increase of capacity is not something that I think we can lose. But Lincoln.
The easy one. I'll take it. The we had 30,000 people in New York City jails 30 years ago, and this plan that was approved by the previous city council intends for capacity of 3,300 beds. Even right now, we're at about 6,000 detainees. What we're talking about here, to Dana's point, is a dramatic reduction in the number of people who are incarcerated in New York City. Rates of the lowest rates of incarceration of any city in the country, rates that are comparable with Western Europe. So, in a world which, as somebody who ran for office just last year, what I would say to constituents is, I aspire to a world where we don't have a need for jails, where we have zero incarceration in New York City. But recognizing that that's going to be a process over time, there is going to be some people who are accused of the most serious crimes, like murder, and there's a need to house them. And we can either house them on Rikers Island in human rights, which is a human rights atrocity, in true squalor, or we can invest in new facilities that can provide a degree of dignity to the people who are housed there. And that is our choice. And it's a lot of money. There's no question. Doing anything in New York City is a lot of money. But what I would say is this: just as we ought to invest in every type of government building to ensure that we're providing care and compassion and dignity and quality services to students in our schools, to people in our hospitals, the same is true for people in DOC facilities as well. And so, yes, we need to do more around ATIs and reentry. Yes, and we are fortunate in New York City to have a truly extraordinary group of reentry-based organizations that do a phenomenal job and really set us apart in the nation in being able to ensure that we can create real quality opportunities for folks. But we also need to invest in therapeutic beds. And this is one of the things that I had a chance to work on in the previous administration that I feel most strongly about. And these are the housing units in our 3 public hospitals that have been identified that will house hundreds of detainees and ensure that they have access around the clock to the mental health services and the physical health care that they need. Unfortunately, we have encountered significant delays on these therapeutic beds, and we cannot allow for further delays. For the people who have serious mental health conditions that are on Rikers Island now, we all know that is not where they should be. Let's get these renovations done so that people have a better place to go.
Well, thank you to our panelists, thanks to the organizers, and thanks to the audience for sticking around for this great event.
Thank you, David.
Thank you to our panelists. At this time, I'm introducing Barbara Bethea, the Director of the Creative Arts Program at Correctional Health Services, to give a brief overview of the program and then the brief playing of a song of one of the songs that were created within that program, to be followed by our final panel of the day. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Bethea, and you're not. And I'm a poetry therapist. I'm the only poetry therapist in the New York City health and hospital system. I'm also the director of the Correctional Health Service Creative Arts Therapy Program at Rikers Island. Correctional Health Services, or CHS, is a division of New York City's health and hospitals and the direct provider of medical and mental health services in the city's jails. The Creative Arts Therapy Program has served people in custody with mental health concerns for over a decade. Our individual and group therapy sessions are facilitated by licensed creative art therapists, LCATs. These master's level practitioners are certified by 5 different national associations and licensed by the state of New York. If you don't mind, I have with me a few of those LCATs with me today and their externs. Would you please stand? LCATs work with patients in the modalities of visual arts, music, dance, drama, and poetry. Wow. LCATs at Rikers work specifically with CHS patients who are living in mental health observation units, which are the therapeutic housing units, which are designed for people with mental health concerns. In therapy sessions, LCATs address their patients' psychological and emotional needs and help them develop social skills. Through sharing their lived experiences in a non-judgmental, creative, and artistically safe environment, our patients feel that they are truly heard by the peers, correction officers, and CHS staff. Now, I just want to give you a small snippet of some of the experiences we might have. One experience, I walked into a mental observation unit previously on one of the jails, and one of, we call them patients, walked up to me and said, "Miss, what are you doing in here? Don't you know there's rapists, murderers, and thieves in here?" And I said, "Really? Well, you go get all of them and you come and we're getting ready to do a group, okay?" And that's what we do on a regular basis. Our collaborative work with our patients has led to some reparative, insightful, and empowering moments in their lives. And these moments have been expressed through some of the artworks you will encounter at our exhibition during today's reception. Through our through our exhibition, you'll hear the voices of the people who are so often marginalized and stigmatized in our society. Their voices deserve an audience and the reflection on the true reforms we can make for public health, the wellness of citizens, and the betterment of our society at large. Please listen now to the voices of Victory and Latif G in a song called My Life, participants in the Creative Arts Therapy Program.
Yeah. Yo. I was going through the most when I was growing up. I was sick to my stomach, almost throwing up. I was ignorant, God, I didn't know enough. I was breaking down, no one cared how I was holding up. No one saw the struggles that I was going through. All they saw was the trouble, how I'm cutting school. The kids I'm around smoking weed, drinking booze. I was stuck in between options, it was hard to choose. And a life of crime is how my story goes. All they see of me now, the product of a broken home. Had to fend for myself, I was all alone. And I got by getting high while going through my lows. Labeled as a trouble youth, I'm in and out of home. Steady searching for the truth, see I'm trying to mend my soul. I was taught fear is something you should never show, so I kept it covered on my body like some underclothes. I was on a mission, surely had a vision, but that was interrupted going in and out of prison. I was a young teen living in them streets was vicious, nothing being handed to me, man, I had to go and get it. I was heated, I was livid, I was focused, they trying to knock me off my pivot. I was hoping you could sit back and listen to what is spoken. Let it wash over your mind and let it soak in. I was different but grouped up in the same boat. After all the trauma I suffered, how I retained hope. I could have fell to the streets to let them things go, but instead I picked up a pen and let my brain flow. And they wanted me buried, they had me dead to right. They wouldn't let me go to sleep, they had me up all night. 27 was the offer, that was almost serving life. 27 was the offer, homie, that ain't nothing light. And I was thinking to myself again, how it's messed up, I don't even have a childhood friend. And I was thinking how I met.
Thank you for listening.
You'll be able to hear the full song at the reception to follow. I'm going to ask that our moderator and panelist for the third panel, please join us on stage.
All right. Hello, 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 everyone. I'm Dean Meminger from New York One News, anchor and criminal justice reporter for New York One. Thank you for all of you who watch. I always start off every conversation with saying, I am a native New Yorker. I'm from the boogie down Bronx in Harlem. So when we talk about these issues, they are real to me, and I'm from here. And Charles, if you want to keep your mask on, that's okay. You sure? Okay. All right, so we're almost on time. I know we were supposed to start at 4:15. It's 4:22, so we're not, I always say, I know people don't want to be here until 11 o'clock tonight, so we will move right along. And this next panel, panel 3, it's all about the culture change and transforming corrections in New York City. And what I want to do is I want to try to make sure we have, not rapid fire answers, Mike, but, you know, that I'm not pointing out, I just know him for a long time. I've had on New York One quite often. You know, but that we answer and keep moving because we do have 5 panelists. And so I do want to introduce everyone and allow everyone to have about 2 to 3 minutes just as an opening statement, you know, to talk about that culture change as we move forward. And even, I guess, culture change today, something that you and I were talking about a little while ago, Charles. So on our panel, we have Liz Gaines, past executive director of the Osborne Association, Michael Jacobson, director, Institute of State and Local Governance, and former New York City Correction Commissioner, retired Deputy Warden John Gallagher, Reverend Sharon White Harrigan, executive director, Women's Community Justice Association, and Charles Billup, chairperson of the Grand Council of Guardians. So, you know, we can start, you know, maybe right here from my left over, just 2 or 3 minutes. When we talk about the culture change and transforming, what is it that you think we need to do? Because everyone here today is here because I guess there is an issue with the jail system in New York City.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Basically, in the idea of transforming the culture, let's keep in mind, you have to think about how it started to get to where you need to get to today. The thing is now is that you have to look at the corrosion over the years from the Giuliani era to where we at now with the present administration, the erosion during that period of time, how it fell apart. And then once you can get an idea of looking at that and trying to figure out where did we went wrong, then you can talk about fixing. The thing is now is that it's like diagnosing someone who has an illness. You got to diagnose it first to find out what the illness is before you decide to treat it. So the thing is now is that you have to look at those things in the idea of, all right, what we need to do to move forward. Do we need to bring in new ideas, bring in new thoughts, or try to give the new people coming in, hopefully a way of looking at things differently? That is probably the best part of doing it. It's no more than what went through with the NYPD during some years ago, during the stop and frisk era, and the same idea, and that same adjustment must be made in correction.
All right, Charles, and Liz, got your 2 to 3 minutes.
Yes, so, I mean, culture, the word culture and corrections sometimes doesn't really go together. I know I work more in the state system, and we say, if you've seen one jail, you've seen one jail. Things are separate and different. Over the many years Osborne was there, and even before at Osborne, my first encounter at Rikers was in 1978 when I had to sue the department for the right to breastfeed in the visiting room. And things have gone up and down since. So I think that we have to really consider the possibility. Most of our folks who work on Rikers have relatives who work for the Department of Correction. There's not this big difference about who is there and what the culture is that people have. You know, my grandfather, roughly translated from the Yiddish, said to me, if you don't like your customers, get out of retail. And he had a grocery store, and Rikers isn't a grocery store, but the truth is that if we continue to think about who our folks are and include the people who work there, live there, and in my personal opinion, the people who visit there, who've been totally dropped out of this discussion, which have a huge impact on the culture of a jail, is the degree to which people can stay connected to the people in their lives, not just to send folks into prison to do the work or into jails to do the work, but it's the people that, families are the reentry program, 24/7. And unless we are thinking about this whole conversation in the context of families and what's available to them and how welcoming we are, I could talk a little bit later about the training that we did with correction officers, partnering with corrections on visiting, and we learned a lot. So
Okay.
I don't want to take up more time.
All right, go ahead.
Well, obviously, you think I'm going to take 40. A couple of things, and I think it is probably worth at some point following up a little on Charles's point about the lack of capacity in the system now, which affects all levels of management. I think there are three issues that the DOC, all related and a bit separate, that the DOC has to deal with immediately. One is, of course, the levels of violence, self-harm, management issues like missed medical appointments, on-time delivery. That's not something that can wait. That has to happen right now. That no one has time. That's not a multi-year process thing. That has to be fixed now. The second thing, I won't spend a lot of time on it, though I can, is this issue of length of stay. Both because it's the path to getting the population down, but also because you cannot hold people for an average of 9 months, to have a third of the people at Rikers there for a year, to have a third of them there more than 2 years, and to have several hundred there for more than 3 years. It's unconscionable. You can't do that. It's a fundamental abrogation of any notion of justice. And it's ultimately, and there are people that you've heard from that are sort of toil on these issues and doing great work, ultimately it's going to require the mayor's sort of political capital and moral authority to do some of this, because that's what our local legal culture here tolerates. But to this issue of culture, I think that the last thing that the system needs to do is start a fundamental re-examining of how correction systems operate, who staffs them, what their requirements are. And as Kendra said, you want to have a system, which sort of seems unthinkable in this context, but where you ask the correction staff what guides their work, what principles they live by, you want everyone to say, we're guided by notions of human dignity and human rights. That's where you want to get to, but I want to emphasize that those are cheap words just to say that. The system has to engage in what will be a multi-year process to re-examine that, to involve other city agencies, the workforce, community members, and especially people with lived experience in Rikers. You have to get there, and that process has to start right now.
All right, we'll keep moving right along. Rev, go ahead.
Yeah, so what does culture really mean, right? When you're talking about a jailed environment, right? To understand that the people that work at Rikers Island, they derive from the same neighborhood as the people who are detained at Rikers Island. So when you talk about the spectrum and the dynamics of trauma, everybody has this line of trauma, right? So what does culture really mean, right? You can't create a positive environment if the people that you have there in a working or professional capacity are traumatized too, and it's not being addressed. So I wouldn't even call it culture. Let's talk about leadership and responsibility. Let's talk about impact. Let's talk about influence. Let's talk about investment. Culture, that's a word that, we really need to look at when we talk about Rikers Island.
All right.
Or DOC.
Or DLC overall. Got it. And okay, go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah, it works.
So I'm John Gallagher. I didn't put a bio in. I don't know how to work computers, but I just retired in December after 32 and a half years. I pretty much stayed, some people I know, I stayed with the mental health and worked with a lot of programs, did a lot of trainings. We created the Crisis Intervention Team program, which I was really passionate about. The Crisis Intervention Team, which I was really passionate about, which is where you had officers and clinicians and psychologists responding to someone with a mental illness in the jail as a team. And that was the big thing. In terms of culture, it was interesting. About 3 years ago, a bunch of us went out to National Institute of Correction, and it popped up. What they found out was two takeaways I had from people become a correction officer, they go to college, they get a degree in criminal justice, and what they find out, that degree doesn't really help you make you a good CO. They said you're better off with psychology, sociology, human resources, anything that's a people person job. And that's the real disconnect when I think they try to compare us to PD and stuff. A cop sees the dude for 8 hours. I see him for 8 months. And if you can't deal, and that's where a lot of the problems come in, where if you can't deal with people, and maybe not the nicest people, like I've said about, they don't like the word inmate now, the detainee, but the person, doesn't mean he's a bad person. He made bad decisions. That's really what happened with a lot of the guys. The trauma, especially when you're talking to women, is overwhelming. The trauma, I never worked with, I spent a month in a woman's jail. I couldn't do it. The histrionics, I could not do it. The screaming and yelling at me, I couldn't do it. I'd rather get punched. No, don't yell at me. But it's a people person job. So one of the things we created CIT, and I think training is a big part. There's two things about culture. There are studies. Organizational culture takes 5 to 7 years. That's what the studies show. What we did learn, because I did a lot of training, I would get the pushback. I'm a CO, I'm not a social worker. So how do you address that? What I will tell you is when you talk to the officers and you talk to the unions, you're not going to win if you tell them you've been doing it wrong. And this is what I would have to do on a daily basis. I never told my officers they were doing it wrong. I would ask them one question: does it work? I was at the forefront of not putting people with serious mental illness in solitary confinement or punitive sec. And people, we did it, that's the way we do it. Does it work? And what happened was I showed examples of guys who would get 40 days punitive seg and accumulate 1,000 days while they were locked in. And they came out worse than when they went in. So does it work? Same thing would be arguing bail reform. Does it work?
Let me jump in, because we're going to come back to some of that. And I know you did this with other panels, but interns will be walking around with cards. If you have a question for them, we will try to get it in as long as we don't run out of time. And I know they had mentioned a hashtag that we are using, but you can let me know your comments too, because I know some people, when I host these, they want to say things directly at me, so you can hit me on social media as well at Dean Meminger on Twitter and Instagram, because this is an important issue. The one thing I heard right away was that it's almost like a family when you're in this system, right? You said the people who are being housed there are from the same community as the correction officers, because quite often many of the correction officers are people of color from the same neighborhoods in Brownsville and the South Bronx. And then I heard you say, which kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, if you don't like your customers, get out of it. So if you're a correction officer and you don't like dealing with inmates, find another job, right? So how do we, and we want to, we don't want to too brief, but as brief as we can, because we're talking about new facilities around the city. And, we have some question about, do you use the term culture? But how do you change the way things are happening right now that, don't happen in these new facilities? Because if you take a messed up family from one house and put them in a better house, well, the house is better, but the family's still messed up. How do you change what's going on now? Whoever we can jump in so that it's not duplicated, because I think that's the whole goal, is to make the system better for everyone.
I do want to say, several years ago, I think you were at Vera, when we did a social impact bond program, and we had our own dorms, and we had steady officers that got trained at this very same time as our staff got trained in youth development. And the steadies were referred to and thought about by the incarcerated people as part of the program. And we discovered that some of them had really come into corrections wanting to make a difference. But in general, it's not the same as a police department. Little kids grow up wanting to be cops. There's not a lot of little kids that say, I'm going to grow up to watch my brothers in cages. When we did training on customer service for the Department of Correction, all the visiting room officers, all the public-facing bail windows, and we asked people why they became correction officers, it was about pension and job security, and they were never really given the chance to think about, could you make a difference in this job? But every program we've ever had that had steadies, where we got to keep the same officers that were trained with us, they seemed actually to like and get benefits from their job, and they didn't go off easily. When we failed in our social impact bond on one measure, but in that youth jail, this was for 16, 18-year-olds, the lowest violence rate ever, because people were engaged and it was possible to do that. So I know it is possible.
Go ahead, Charles.
See, but the catch to what she's saying now is not going to fit with the new borough facilities. I understand what she's saying. She's talking about when they had what is called unit management in the facilities. That was during the period of time when he was there. Right now, based on the way they are designing the new borough facilities, it's not dormitory type settings where you can sit down and gather people unless you're going to pull them all out into a day room area or some central area where you can have those kinds of discussions. The problem you're going to have now is that in the borough facilities is that these are isolated cells. So once they get past that interaction, what they may create in some common area, they got to go back to their cells. At least in the dormitory type setting, they was able to see each other, talk to each other throughout the day, in the evening, and things like that. So those are the things that they have to think about when they're talking about borough facilities. So we're talking about doing something now. Those same type of ideas and programs could easily be implemented. It was just that over the last several years, those ideas and those things change. Let's take it back to when I heard it earlier, somebody was talking about doing outreach, preparing people back into reentry, back into the cities, or back into regular life. Those programs we had years ago where they were teaching the incarcerated people about the different programs, training them, giving them certificates and things like that in the different areas, those things were in place. But over the years, the city literally took those programs out. Budgeting, money, I don't know the reason why. I wasn't a mayor at the time, but I know those programs did exist. And then over the years, those programs quickly just disappeared. And they took them completely away.
Go ahead.
So this country is built on punitive measures. We need to change the narrative, not just DOC, but society as a whole. We need to stop looking at people as if they deserve to be locked up and see them as people who need support, that needs their trauma treated, that needs help. Right? And I think that's where, that's where we start, right? It's not programming and all of these other things, because history has proven it doesn't work. And when you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results, that is insanity, right? And this is what our country, United States, and New York, that's what we do. We always look to try to do something different, don't quite do it, don't get it right, and then we wind up having these same conversations, panels, discussions, events, conferences, and don't do anything about it. Can the church say it?
And she didn't need the mic. And she didn't need the mic for that either. But and that's important. But one of the things I also like to bring up is when we have these conversations, we talk about the people who are incarcerated. We talk about the COs. But a lot of people will say, well, what about the victims and those who have lost a son because someone shot a 15-year-old on the train? What about that mom? What is the justice that she's getting? Where's the difference for her? Some of that, and maybe you could talk to this, Gallagher, about the officers, something that I know I've covered over the last year, morale for the officers just not showing up. And like you said, maybe it's the pension, maybe it's the money, and I can be out sick. But some people will say, well, if there's bad morale for the officers, they're not showing up, they don't like their job, how do we change that for them, the COs, so that the system perhaps can be better, starting with them?
Well, yeah, so, I mean, one of the reasons I left, because I worked at Bellevue, I had an easy gig compared to Rikers, but I had to go to Rikers twice a month. And you saw, staff just, they gave up. That's the best way to describe what was going on. The officers, supervisors wouldn't, it wasn't it was gradual, but it just collapsed. And COVID was the death knell of it, you know. And there were policies put in place, which they don't talk about, kept. When COVID first hit, if you were an officer and you had sniffles or fever, you were mandated to stay out for 14 days. And then they had the health management division who put you back to work. They closed. I had officers in my command telling me, Depp, I'm trying to get back to work. They won't let me go back to work. I mean, there was so many issues. That's just one tiny example.
Well, COVID became a big problem for a lot of people,
I think that
right?
was the death knell. COVID just, it made a bad situation horrible.
But how do you change it moving forward? Because now folks can go
you talk
back
about
to work.
culture, the key thing about culture, I had this with the mental. When I first took over the mental health area, nobody wanted to work in that area unless they could get a steady tour. By the time we finished, people were volunteering. And a lot of it was recruiting the right staff, the right supervisors. And a lot of it was really good intensive training. Some of my guys got over 120 hours training and multidisciplinary training, which meant I'm sitting there, there's the social worker, there's the psychologist, we're a team, the clinician, all in the same unit. And what we tried to do, the argument I would get from officers, I'm not a social worker. And I would tell them, you don't need to have a master's degree or a psychologist to observe behaviors. So we had a suicide, this is how your department functioned, talk about old correction, what we tried to change. And I was still never to change this. So when a person goes on suicide watch, the officer's required to fill out a 15-minute watch sheet. Every 15 minutes, what's to do? So what would the officer write? He appears normal, appears okay. What does that mean? I don't know what the hell that means. Okay means I'm having a beer. That's me. What's okay for you? So we had the psychologist sit with them. He's taking a shower. He's sleeping. He's talking. He's basic behaviors. Don't need a social degree, a social work degree for that. It gets better. DOC policy. Guess where that piece of paper goes? In his legal folder. Where should it go? To the doctor. It's a 24-hour snapshot on a person's behavior. Psychologists would love that. I'm just giving an example how policy, by the trainings, we able to change some of the policy where it just made sense. And the training was essential. Like one of the things with CIT, I was fanatical that you have to put the Stanford Prison Experiment in this training. If anybody knows that training, you need, and it's to be taught, because the extraordinarily controversial, can never be repeated again. But the lesson of Stanford is, it's not the apples that are bad, it's the barrel. You put white, middle-class college kids in a jail with a messed up environment, you got a riot, an attempted escape, brutality, assaults, all hell broke. They had to cancel the experiment, if you know it. It's very interesting if you don't know about it. But I think every correction department should put that in their training. Just to give you that. And the key thing, I think, tying in with the new jails, the small jail, officers are very cynical, and I'm cynical too. Don't tell me, show me. In order for this to work, and people talk about the unions, get one of these small jails open. Staff it, set it up right, and word will get out to Rikers. Word will get back to Rikers. Dude, we need to go there. You need to go to whatever the new jail name is. Was it Spofford Avenue Jail? Whatever jail you want to name it. Word will get out to the staff. This is the way to go, because it makes their life easier. The commute is easy, whatever it may be. But that's the key. If you try to open all these things at the same time, I don't think it'll be as successful.
I want to jump in, though, and have Mike and Liz talk about helping those who are at Rikers or other jail facilities. Because, I mean, at this point, there's a lot of talk about Rikers, right? But there were facilities all over, and we still have the barge. Helping with recidivism. How do you help those who are there to be better when they get out? And we're talking about, I guess, a holistic approach, right? It's training, but it's mental health care. It's changing the way you think about yourself and society. How do we do that? Because at the end of the day, we don't want to see those same people harming individuals outside or back in locked up.
And so I guess I have a two-part answer. I mean, the first way to answer that is you just have less people in them, right? We have too many people in jail. And again, that goes to the fact that so many of them are there for so long, right? If you're in Rikers for 2 to 3 years, the chances are, almost nil that you're going to be better off when you leave than when you're there, right? You're going to be worse, and that whether that's hospital visits or recidivism, you can't keep that many people there for that long and expect low recidivism rates. And again, those length of stays are related not just to how many people are in, but violence as well. You can't keep people in facilities like this for 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, and 36 months and think you're not going to have high levels of violence. There's a correlation between how many people are there and the violence you have. The way I tend to think about your question, other than fewer people should be in jail, is that Rikers right now, a lot of people have mentioned this, $500,000 a year on average. Rikers is by far the most well-resourced incarceration system on earth. There is no place, not Scandinavia, not Amsterdam, no place that has the resources that Rikers does. Rikers has a lot of issues. Money is not one of them. So, there's all sorts of ways one could imagine, both with a smaller population, to take some of that money, and I should make the plug quickly, because in the last panel it came up what the cost of these facilities are, and yes, $10 billion is a lot of money. That turns into about $700 million a year in debt service. That's how the city finances these things. We estimate the savings to be $2 billion a year. That's how many fewer staff you will need to do this. So if the city does this right, we estimate you'll save over $1 billion a year. $1 billion a year buys you a lot of resources, not just jail-based resources, but resources in the community that can cut the pipeline and help people when they leave. That's how you fund this
Is
stuff.
that money giving more, so we get to an answer in terms of recidivism and helping people not to return, that money saving should go into programs inside the facility?
Well, not just inside the facilities, in communities as well. But, even in New York City, $1 billion, that's real money. But it does require the city to, in fact, take those savings to get the population down, to get the size of the workforce down, to have a different kind of workforce, and to reinvest that money in these sorts of things, not just in jails, but outside of jails.
And I know you were going to answer, Liz, but I want to add, someone sent up this question, and because you said you did so much work with the state prison system as well, this is a question from the audience, which kind of makes sense. How does this conversation play into the state prison system? Does a culture shift in the city jails matter if incarcerated people then end up in prisons, upstate, where culture has not shifted?
So I started my career representing the Attica brothers in 1971. So I've seen a few jails and prison. Well, actually, they're prisons, but for some reason, state prison system calls them jails. So they're all different, and the culture is different. And I've been in, 4 jails and prisons in 4 continents, 7 countries, 17 states. They're not designed around recidivism. It's not their job, actually. The job of prisons and jails is to keep people safe in the most humane possible environment, and it's the rest of society that's got to figure out what would make it possible. People live into a future they see for themselves. So the best that a jail could do is to create an opportunity for people to see that they have a future beyond jail. Apple can come up with a new iPhone every year, and we have not come up with a fucking replacement to cages in 150 years. That is not going to happen. It's not going to suddenly be these are the people that we're going to look to for recidivism. Recidivism is going to be a function of people's families, the resources in the community, and how they are treated. Because when you mistreat people in jail, including mistreating officers by not paying attention to the training and support that they need, you're going to get what you got. And that's also true upstate. The difference upstate is upstate.
One big thing about upstate, which is an ongoing, I think they finally rectified it. So New York City had the first methadone program in any jail in the country. And state correction refused to give them methadone. And this went on for years. So the guys starting the program, and I know it was a battle before I left, where they said, you know what, we're not going to send them upstate. We got this guy on methadone, he has to wean it off. And that was a good example of the state and the city weren't on the same page. And talk about length of stay, I just wanted to bring this up because nobody's ever talked about it. So I left last year. We had an individual in our custody, his arrest date was in 1986. 27 Article 730s. Article 730 is fitness to proceed. The length of stay for the mental health is unbelievable. It's 2 to 3 times longer. And what really always pissed me off is you can put everybody in the same room. DAs, the Correction Officers Union, prosecutors, judges, who say the mentally ill should not be dumped in the jail, and we still can't solve this problem.
But, go ahead on.
So I think the word is investment. We say reinvestment, but there's never been an investment in these disenfranchised, marginalized community. And I'm sorry, I'm formerly incarcerated. So on this panel, I've been there, been to Rikers, been upstate in Bedford Hills for over a decade. And the bottom line is, if there were resources in the community from the beginning, we need to talk about prevention. Right? Not recidivism. We need to talk about prevention so people don't go in from the jump. That should be our conversation. I'm sorry. Like, I think we just need to kind of, really get down.
And that's
to
when
the-
he said,
to
if
the-
there's
to
a
the
savings
nitty-gritty.
in $2 billion, and you, I think you all are saying it's just not put it in the jail or the prison complex beforehand, before people get
Over
there.
$500,000.
I think I have a fiery panel, right?
Right.
I think I started off by saying I'm from New York. Go ahead on, Charles.
But no, what she's saying is correct, though, because those programs should be in place in the communities and also in the courts. I mean, if you want to reduce the numbers on Rikers, you should be approaching these individuals in the streets, in the neighborhoods, or either in the courts. Those programs should be available for individuals. They should be examined, analyzed, whatever word you want to use. These people should be looked at, dealt with right there in the court, and then they should be decided if it's a need for what program or what social issue they may have, whether it's mental or anything else. Those people should be identified at the courts, because if you can identify them there, then you can prevent Rikers and have them placed to where they should be. Now, and then on top of that, this conversation needs to go a little further, because as they lead to, it talks about the DAs. Because I don't know about any of y'all in the audience, if you ever sat in the courtroom, the ADAs push to get those numbers in. Yeah. That's basically what it comes down to. Regardless whether the person threw out a piece of paper on the garbage, out of the garbage on the floor, or he committed murder. It's the idea of putting them in the system. So the thing is now is that if you really want to try to help people, you need to catch them before they get to Rikers in the courts or either in the neighborhoods.
But I thought I've heard recently a lot of DAs say no, they are not pushing for people to be incarcerated for minor issues.
No, what you're saying is
issues that are not seriously violent.
No, I'm not disagreeing. They say it, but what happens is another thing.
Okay.
Right.
But I'll tell you about the mental health aspect. One of the real tragedies is, and that's why I tell people stay away from diagnosis in these reports with SMI. It's very hard to diagnose somebody in a jail. Stick to treatment. And when I mean that, what's the level of treatment this individual needs? But more importantly, the first time a person ever gets any mental treatment, people from poor, low-income, guess where it is? It's not a hospital. It's in jail. That's what Charles is talking about.
And what does that look like for the black community?
And to me, when they start these programs, my recommendation for years is we need to get not social workers, we need trained therapists in our grammar schools. Because if you see the level of trauma, social workers are great.
They're licensed therapists.
Social workers are great, but I'm talking about. I'm not beating up. I didn't mean it like that, please. But social workers are great for seeing the problem. But I'm talking about therapists behaviorists who are going to fix the problem. I'm talking about 6, 7. These guys, the trauma, the physical, the mental abuse, that's what's starting this whole thing. So even before he gets to court, even before he gets to high school, and I'm not talking about training one social worker for a whole classroom. I'm not asking for a teacher to be trained for evidence of trauma.
And they need to be culturally relatable.
And that's a part of it too.
Relatable.
But that's why I said we need to, people wait till they get to court, wait till they get jail. We need to hit,
Can I
it's so
add
severe,
something to
hit it when it's in the grammar school.
Hold on, she's being kind, but
I'm sorry.
she started the cursing though, so go ahead. But she was right, but go ahead, and then I'll.
That's what happens. Once you're 75, there's no edit button, and you just say
Oh,
whatever
I've had grandmothers and great-grandmothers, and I'd have to say, why'd you say that in front of my friends? Go ahead, Liz, because this is important information, because as I often say, we're not just talking about numbers. We are talking about people. And sometimes, as I've heard some of the COs and other people here say, it's their own family members who are working there or on Rikers because they've hurt someone. And then some of us have individuals who have been hurt and murdered. So, we're really talking about people here. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, if all we're offering victims is putting someone in jail, we are really not doing right by victims.
Okay.
Given any choices besides that, victims need a lot more than that. So dragging them into this is really not fair, because what we're talking about is it's not going to help the victims to have a culture that is harmful to the people that are in there. They're not going to be better. I don't disagree with anything Sharon says and anything Sharon ever will say. However, I think we have to focus a little bit on the fact that in the meantime, there are people in jail. And I think whether they're in a dorm or in cells, you can at least find a way to do no harm. And training is part of it. I don't know about social workers, but I know every little boy and girl grows up wanting to make a difference, including people who ended up being correction officers, even if they did it for a pension. And if you can connect people, the people that are in prison and jail and the people that work there, with being able to see a possibility that they can make a difference with another person and with themselves and with their family, that's the only way you can change a culture there. Everyone has to be. I don't know about being a social worker, but our steady officers that we've had over the years were better than any social worker I've ever had to, who's ever tried to, well, okay, not the social workers that work in our program. But they really made a difference for people. But when we did the training for correction officers and we asked them how it could be better, how we could improve visiting, there was total silence. And we said, you've been doing this work a long time. First of all, they didn't bid those jobs. There's a ridiculous bidding system on jobs in the city system. But they were silent for like 2 minutes, and we said, don't you have any ideas? They said, nobody's ever asked us. And so I actually think there are some real opportunities here to engage the people that are in jail.
Called investment.
And investing in the people that live in, work in, and visit our facilities.
Do you still need to, can I go to the next question? Go ahead.
No, this will be quick. This will be real quick. But, the first thing is, what she brought up is true. But the key thing is now is that everyone, officer, incarcerated person, the person who's waiting for trial or whatever it may be, must feel safe first. That's the key thing. I don't care what anyone says, you can close down the Empire State Building. If people don't feel safe and they don't have the idea of being safe in a right environment, all of that is just a waste of time. Whether the person locked up in the cell or the officer. Everyone must feel safe. That's the first thing. Mm-hmm. And then second thing is what I want to talk about, what they brought up earlier was that there are programs that they can easily better. I would say better. For instance, right now they had the supervised release program where they literally giving people, with the ankle bracelet and stuff to let people go home instead of Rikers. They can increase those numbers and be part of that process, having those people see social workers or counselors or mental health people to deal with whatever issues they have instead of placing them in Rikers. So those are some of the things that can easily be increased or enhanced to make it work.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if this question is on point, if this is the plan, but it says, why is reducing staff numbers being highlighted as a positive when short staffing of officers and civilian care providers currently is lending to some of the worst atrocities detainees see on Rikers and that they're facing? Is that something that, moving forward, that it's reducing staff with these smaller facilities?
Absolutely. Yeah, and look, here's Here's the thing about the staffing. While it's true that there are greater numbers of officers who are calling in sick or going AWOL, that never used to be a thing, and on modified duty, it's a big percent. You can't possibly explain what's happening there, given that. Because even with a couple of thousand officers not coming to work every day, you still have 5,000 officers to deal with a population roughly of 5,000 people. No one has that kind of staff, no one. So that the vision for these new facilities and why it's so important to do that organizational shift before you move in is that they're smaller facilities. The population should be much smaller than it is now. They're well-designed facilities, they're efficient facilities. The goal is to have a smaller workforce, that's definitely true, but also a better trained workforce, a more specialized workforce. It may be that you need way more civilian staff than you do uniform or security staff. All that should be open for debate and analysis. You know, there's no, I would venture to say right now, there's not one officer who works in DOC who wakes up, tomorrow and says, I work in AMKC. I want to get there early. I can't wait to get to AMKC. I mean, no one says that, right? And I mean, obviously, it's true for the incarcerated folks, but it's true. I mean, why would anyone want to work in these facilities? So the goal is definitely to have a smaller workforce, a different workforce. Kendra talked about the fact that in some of these countries, you get trained for 2 years. They're sort of high-paying, well-respected public service jobs. They're very complicated. People are incredibly satisfied with them. That's where you want to get to. But yes, there's no route to doing this with savings unless you get the staffing down, and there's nothing that would ever indicate you need more than 3,400 officers for a population of 3,400 people.
And we run out of time. I'm used to having what we call an IFB in my ear, and the producer's telling me, wrap it. I didn't see your sign there. They're like, 1 minute. But I mean, just a yes or no here, because sometimes people watching who may not be involved with the system as much, they hear these conversations and they hear people saying, oh, let violent people out on the street. That's not what this conversation is about. Am I correct? Like, no one's saying someone who shot or stabbed or killed someone, they should not be serving time or they should not be held. Am I right?
They need resources and they need help, right? Hurt people, heal people, heal people. They need to be on the pathway to healing. Most people who are on that, we need to understand the difference between an act of violence and a violent person. And understanding that when people commit an act of violence, sometimes it's out of survival, other times it's really off of trauma. So that's what needs to be dealt with, that anger, that trauma. So they need help.
Get it?
30 seconds.
Get it adjudicated. Did he do it or didn't he?
So get the court system rolling too.
Get it.
All right, we have to wrap. I'm Dean Memminger. Thank you all. I'll say this again. Let me know, on Twitter and Instagram at Dean Memminger what you think. I thought this was a great panel. Thank you all so much. We can now go for another hour. I know that, but we have to wrap it up. Thank you all.
It's not over yet.
It's not over. We have
It's
more
almost
face-to-face time now. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not over.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I apologize. You were behind. She's like, we have one more talker, Dean. Be quiet. Okay,
No,
thank
it's
you.
not a talk. I am going to close you out. Good afternoon. I'm Carol Mason, the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Some of you still think Jeremy's the president, but he passed the torch 5 years ago. And so I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the folks who are watching this online, because it's an important issue. And I want to thank Dana and the Littman Commission. You know the official name. I'm just going to give the short name. Thank you, Judge Littman, for making us have this conversation, because we've got 5 years under the original plan to get this right. Now, you had a lot of conversations today, and the beauty of John Jay and the beauty of this space is you didn't hear agreement, because the whole goal is to give people an opportunity to express their views. And the role of John Jay is to give you that space so that we come deal with these difficult issues Stay in conversation with each other. I heard the Reverend say we've been having these conversations for years and not making any progress. Well, we are. It's just slow. But we're here to expedite it, right? Right? So we've got 5 years to get this right. We don't have to wait 5 years to get it right. But if you're hearing some threads through all of this, and you hear about investment, and we need to be investing in our communities on the front end and giving them support. We don't have to wait for that $1 billion of savings to invest now. Invest in our young people, our communities, and we all know the question about recidivism, we all know the answers to that. The research has been there for decades. It's not new. Jobs, housing, connection to family, education. Let's invest in those things on the front end, not just once people are incarcerated. But, as Liz said, the fact of the matter is we still have a lot of people in our system. And we still need to prepare them to come home too, because most people come home. The other thing we have to do is, if you heard, there's another thread and theme in all of this, is that we need to reduce the footprint of people who are sitting in our jails waiting for adjudication. Waiting for adjudication. They're in Rikers because they haven't been tried or convicted of anything yet. And so the question is, how do we reduce the number of people who are in our systems and reduce the number we have waiting in jail to be determined whether they're innocent or guilty? We've got a student who graduated with honors 2 years ago who sat 3 years in Rikers, was found not guilty, and found her way here to John Jay. That should not happen. And she's just one child. And Wesley, you know, if you don't know Wesley's story, go look it up, see the Bard film. He's phenomenal. He should not have been in prison either. And so the question we've got to do as a society, as a community, as you people here who are caring about this issue, because you sat here for several hours because you are concerned and you believe that change is possible. So if you believe that change is possible, you've got to do something. You've got to actually do something. You're all in positions where you can make this change happen. You can all invest in your communities where you are and making sure, speak up, go to city council meetings when they're figuring out the budget, and ask them to invest in your communities. Ask them to invest in your children. Ask them to invest in your parents. Ask them to invest. Ask them to invest in mental health and alternatives. Now, what we know is New York, you might think this is bad, but we're ahead of the game, because we are focused on these issues in New York. The reason why we know what works is because we've got success stories, because people have invested in this. What we've got to do now is leverage that investment and make it broader to reach many, many more communities. So I'm supposed to thank a lot of people, but I got to go to another meeting. So really, everybody here deserves a thank you, because you showed up and you stayed. But again, I want to hear who's committed to staying in the work. Because where's Reverend? Where'd she go? Where'd she go? So Reverend, I don't want to see you here in 2 years, not 5 years, telling me we didn't do anything. Okay? So the Reverend here is going to hold us accountable to make sure you go do something. And if you have questions and don't know what to do, call us at John Jay. Call the folks, call any of the folks who are on the panels here. We can tell you how you can help. There, you know, if you need some ideas, we've got ideas and solutions. So I need you all committed to doing this. And again, I want to thank everybody that showed up today. I want to thank the Littman Commission folks. I want to thank Jeremy at Arnold. I want to thank the Art for Justice Fund, because that makes a difference too. Bringing art into places really makes a difference. So I'm supposed to introduce somebody else, because I see these nice, pretty remarks that I never use, because I got too worked up. And one other thing I want to address, Dean, you mentioned victims. I guarantee you every victim you ask will say, I don't want anybody else to be a victim. So they want us to fix this system so that we don't have any more victims. They're not worried about locking somebody up. They're worried about how to prevent this from ever happening. And this conversation and this work that we're doing today, that's to work to make sure that we reduce the number of victims going forward, because as the Reverend said, hurt people hurt people. We are about healing and transforming lives. Everybody in this room, right? That's why you showed up, right? Right? So let's do this work, okay? We can really do this, and I'm counting on you all. And who was it? Liz said she's 75, I'm 65, and I don't intend to stop this work until I see change. And so I want to get there before Liz at 75, okay? All right, Liz? All right, so I have to introduce Councilmember Carlina Rivera, who is really going to close us out, if I can find my right page. So she has been, all right, where'd I go? Okay, you know who you are. So I've got some more details about you, but she's going to tell you herself. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. All right, everyone. She did all the thank yous, but I do have to say to all of the advocates in this room, you were just with me yesterday at a hearing in the City Council examining how drugs are entering those jails, even when visitation by family was suspended. So no, there is the culture, how entrenched and dysfunctional it is. I want to thank my team at the City Council. We have people here, Isabel Chandler, many folks, but you know the Lippman Commission, Data Collaborative for Justice, John Jay. You've heard from a lot of people today, and I think we all want the same thing. We would love to be in a New York City where we did not consider the system that is known as Rikers, as New York City jails, as a place for rehabilitation. We know that is not where rehabilitation takes place. So the City Council passed a plan to close Rikers Island by 2027. Specifically, this facility and its conditions are deplorable. I think many of us, even if you have not been there, you have heard the stories, you have seen the photos. It never does seem to get any better, but it's taken a lot of work to get to this point, and we have to keep the Department of Correction and this administration on course. And it's also important to keep in mind the scope of closing Rikers extends beyond the Department of Correction. It is going to take work across multiple city agencies and oversight bodies, and sometimes that's where it gets a little tricky with bureaucracy and accountability and people pointing fingers, and nothing ends up getting done. So I will continue to push the plan in my capacity. I'm the chair of the Committee on Criminal Justice. Yeah, thank you. That's very nice. We have to advocate for necessary actions. It includes, but not limited to, a lot of what you heard from the people here who have lived experience, who've been doing this for many years, and that's reducing the incarcerated population, period. That's recalibrating the department's bloated budget. That's right-sizing correction staff. That's investing in services and programs that build safe communities and that center humanity, which I feel like gets lost in many of the stories and things that are actually covered by the media. So we have a charter-mandated responsibility as a council of oversight and investigation, and that is what we try to practice in a responsible way. And every movement that has actually seen change has been, I think, advocate-led. And so they have been incredible in really supporting my own journey. And so we have to continue to organize and show up. Reducing the jail population to the lowest in New York City in 100 years is going to take sustained political will. And we cannot afford to become complacent. We also have to continue to organize around the design and operations of borough-based jails. That's critical. We have to reduce the abuse, the neglect, and the inadequate care that has persisted in the carceral system. And if you don't believe the stories, all you have to do is look at the data. Look who is missing their medical appointments. Look who is not getting served over the years, who is historically part of a disenfranchised, marginalized community. It's very clear. So on Thursday, tomorrow, I plan to introduce legislation which would establish jail population review teams for each borough to identify people in custody to the Department of Correction whose cases could be solved, or for people who could be safely released into the community. So I'm excited for that. Thank you very much. I encourage you, call your council member, tell them to sign on, please, because we have to get this done. And additionally, on the legislative front, this was mentioned about treatment, but the state has to pass, and the mayor should publicly support Treatment Not Jails Act. Expanding eligibility for treatment for court-involved individuals and shift the presumption from incarceration to community support. And so the budget process is crucial, and the council needs full transparency, which is always a challenge, to assess the DOC's budget and the ability to stay on track with the plan to close Rikers. If any of you have noticed, there have been discrepancies in reporting. That's been a problem for years during budget negotiations and were an issue this budget cycle. And in fact, this past budget, the DOC was looking to increase their headcount this fiscal year by 578 positions, without accounting for what the majority of the positions would actually be. So I was not convinced that there was a need to expand DOC personnel and ensure that this addition was not included in this year's budget. And so we had to end New York City's dependence on criminalization and incarceration, and we have to redirect those funds. And you've heard what is the most important. It's alternatives to incarceration. It's supervised release. It's reentry programs. It's supportive housing and housing, period. And so these programs, you know, they're not only proven to make communities safer by reducing recidivism and crime rates, but they're also far more cost effective. What we spend on this system and what it's producing. So the tough work continues. I know, again, I mentioned that culture of punishment and dehumanization, which is really, really just tragic. And New York City, I know it was mentioned we're ahead, but there's no reason why we shouldn't be leading the way. 17 people have died on Rikers so far this year. 2022 is the deadliest year on Rikers in recent history. Incarceration should not be a death sentence. So the DOC and this administration, they must take responsibility for the failing jail system. They have to drastically speed up reforms. I know we're all on board with that. Improve conditions and outcomes. It's up to us to show up and keep the pressure on. And we understand when you hold us accountable too. That is a part of the relationship between government and the public. So I'm in this fight with you. I look forward to opportunities for continued collaboration, advancing policies that protect all New Yorkers. And I really hope that at the very least, we can do something to show that these are people. These are people who need support. So I want to thank you all for your many, many years of service and all that you're doing, and for actually being in this room right now and showing you care. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am not up as the last speaker. I am up to say that the reception is beginning. I really hope that people can join us, stick around. There's food, there's drinks, there's also the Rikers Public Memory Project. There's some of the incredible artwork and music from the program that we heard about from Correctional Health Services. And so please replenish your souls after a very, very long afternoon. So thank you, John Jay, for hosting, and please come enjoy some food.